For nearly all of human history, waking up was not an act of obedience. It was a biological unfolding. Light shifted slowly across the horizon, the air changed, birds began to move, and the body followed. There was no sudden command, no sharp interruption. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was woven into the rhythm of the earth itself. And yet today, millions of us begin each morning not with dawn, but with a mechanical sound that cuts through the deepest phase of sleep. A device decides the moment our nervous system must switch states. In evolutionary terms, this is almost nothing, barely a few centuries set against hundreds of thousands of years of gradual awakening. What happens to a species shaped by sunrise when it begins to wake by alarm? And more quietly, why were humans never meant to wake up to an alarm clock? Long before any clock measured a minute, morning was not an instruction but a transition. For most of the 200,000 years that Homo sapiens have existed, waking up did not happen at a fixed number on a dial. It unfolded slowly, guided by environmental signals that changed in predictable ways across seasons and landscapes. The first humans did not rise because something demanded it. They rose because light, temperature, and internal chemistry aligned. In equatorial regions where our species first evolved, the shift from night to day was gradual. Darkness softened, the horizon brightened. Air cooled slightly before dawn, then began to warm. Birds and insects adjusted their activity. These external cues were consistent across generations, shaping nervous systems long before mechanical sound ever existed. The human body learned to anticipate sunrise through an internal timing system that synchronized with the rotation of the Earth. This system did not depend on numbers. It depended on repetition over thousands of years. Archaeological evidence from early human campsites in Africa suggests repeated occupation patterns that followed seasonal cycles rather than hourly schedules. Hearth remains indicate activity beginning after daylight, not before it. There is no trace in the material record of abrupt awakenings imposed at arbitrary times. Instead, survival tasks, gathering, hunting, preparing tools were structured around daylight availability. In this environment, waking was integrated into ecological rhythm. From a biological perspective, the shift from sleep to wakefulness is governed by coordinated hormonal changes. Melatonin, which rises in darkness, begins to fall as light enters the retina, even through closed eyelids. Cortisol, often called a stress hormone but more accurately a mobilization hormone, naturally increases in the early morning hours. This rise is gradual and predictable. It prepares the body to move, think, and regulate blood pressure. In a natural setting, these changes align with increasing brightness. The nervous system transitions from parasympathetic dominance during deep sleep to a balanced state that allows awareness without shock. When early humans opened their eyes, they did so at the edge of a sleep cycle. Often after lighter phases of sleep, the brain had already begun to shift. This pattern was not accidental. It was reinforced over countless generations whose survival depended on efficient energy use. Abrupt arousal in the middle of deep sleep would have carried physiological costs, increasing disorientation and reducing immediate coordination. In environments where predators, terrain, and social cooperation mattered, gradual awakening supported stable function. Anthropological studies of present-day hunter-gatherer groups, such as the Hadza of Tanzania, show variability in waking times that correspond to sunrise and season rather than strict uniformity. Individuals do not all rise simultaneously at an imposed signal. Some wake earlier, some later, yet the group functions collectively. This flexibility reflects an internal clock tuned to light and need, not to precision minutes. For most of human existence, the question was not, what time is it, but, is there light? Morning was therefore not a command, but a condition. The earth turned, and bodies responded. In evolutionary terms, this arrangement persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, long enough to engrave itself into human physiology. The alarm clock, by contrast, belongs to a narrow slice of recent history. When measured against the span of our species, mechanical awakening occupies less than a fraction of 1% of our existence. The human morning began as a negotiation between brain and sunrise, shaped in open landscapes under predictable skies. To understand whether we were meant to wake to an alarm, we must first recognize how deeply the opposite pattern is rooted in our origin. In those early landscapes where our species first learned to survive, Night was not an empty interval but a structured state. Sleep did not fall like a switch. It deepened and lightened in cycles that repeated several times before dawn. In the absence of artificial light, darkness was nearly absolute, especially in open savanna or woodland away from firelight. Under these conditions, human sleep likely aligned closely with the natural night, extending longer in winter and shortening in summer. What matters for understanding awakening is not only when sleep ended, but how it ended. The architecture of human sleep, alternating phases of non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement, appears to be conserved across populations worldwide. These cycles last roughly 90 minutes in adults, though they vary. Toward the latter portion of the night, lighter stages of sleep become more frequent. The brain begins to show patterns closer to waking activity. Heart rate and breathing subtly increase. Body temperature, which dropped during the night, begins to rise. In an environment without mechanical interruption, awakening most often occurs at the edge of these lighter phases. This means that by the time eyes open, the nervous system has already initiated transition. For early humans, this timing was not planned consciously, but it was predictable biologically. Light penetrating the eyelids suppresses melatonin production. Even small increases in ambient brightness before sunrise can influence this process. The retina contains specialized cells sensitive to blue wavelengths, which are abundant in morning light. Signals from these cells travel to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a small cluster of neurons in the hypothalamus that coordinates circadian rhythm. This internal clock adjusts daily, synchronizing physiology to the external cycle of light and darkness. Over tens of thousands of years, individuals whose internal clocks aligned effectively with sunrise would have maintained stable energy patterns. Those with severe misalignment may have struggled with alertness or coordination during critical morning tasks. Although natural selection does not operate on alarm clocks, it does operate on biological timing. The gradual coordination between internal rhythms and environmental dawn is therefore not incidental. It is part of the inherited structure of our species. Archaeological findings from Upper Paleolithic sites show hearths positioned to maximize warmth and possibly light during evening hours, but they do not suggest systematic pre-dawn activity requiring uniform waking. The rhythm of daily labor followed light availability. Hunting large game often began after sufficient visibility. Gathering required the ability to distinguish plants clearly. These activities depended on visual acuity restored by daylight, not by artificial demand. In addition, early human groups exhibited social staggering in sleep and wake cycles. Ethnographic observations among modern forager groups indicate that at least one individual is often awake at any given time during the night, tending fire or responding to environmental sounds. Yet this vigilance rotates naturally, without synchronized alarms. The group remains protected without requiring everyone to rise simultaneously at a fixed minute. This pattern reflects a flexible distribution of alertness rather than a collective abrupt start. When considered against this background, waking appears less like a sharp event and more like the final movement of a slow biological sequence. The brain has already transitioned through lighter sleep. Hormonal signals have shifted. External light has increased. Muscles regain tone gradually. The body does not leap from deep restoration into full mobilization. It crosses a threshold. For the majority of human history, this threshold was crossed in partnership with dawn. The absence of sudden auditory shock allowed the cardiovascular system to adjust incrementally. Blood pressure rose in coordination with hormonal cues, rather than in response to immediate startle. Over evolutionary time, such gradual transitions would have supported metabolic stability and cognitive clarity in early morning tasks. To understand what it means to wake to an alarm, we must hold this image firmly. A species whose mornings were synchronized with light, whose sleep cycles tapered toward waking, and whose daily labor began when the environment signaled readiness. The original human morning was not dictated. It emerged from the interaction between internal rhythm and the turning earth. If we move beyond hormones and sleep cycles and look at the physical spaces early humans inhabited, the character of morning becomes even clearer. For most of our existence, we slept close to the ground, often in temporary shelters, caves, or open-air camps arranged around a fire. There were no insulated walls to seal out gradual changes in temperature. No thick curtains blocked the horizon. the body remained in subtle contact with environmental shifts. Before sunrise, air temperature often drops to its lowest point of the night. This cooling influences peripheral blood vessels and can contribute to lighter sleep toward dawn. As the sun rises, warmth returns slowly. The skin senses this change even before full brightness arrives. In this way, the environment itself functioned as a gentle regulator. Archaeological sites across Africa and Eurasia show repeated patterns of campsite placement that maximized access to water, shelter, and morning light. Openings of rock shelters sometimes face east, allowing early light to enter. While we cannot assume deliberate architectural planning in every case, orientation toward light was practical. Light signaled safety, visibility, and opportunity. Over thousands of generations, the association between increasing brightness and daily activity became deeply encoded. Importantly, there is no evidence that early human groups organized their mornings around a synchronized instant. Ethnographic research among contemporary hunter-gatherers, including groups in Tanzania and the Kalahari, reveals variation in waking times within the same camp. Some individuals rise earlier to rekindle a fire, others remain asleep until full daylight. Children often wake later than adults. This variability suggests that early human mornings were distributed, not compressed into a single enforced moment. The group functioned through overlap, not uniformity. From an evolutionary perspective, this staggered awakening has advantages. It reduces collective vulnerability. It allows at least some members to be alert if needed, without exhausting everyone simultaneously. It also reflects individual chronotypes, natural variations in internal timing that exist in modern populations as well. Genetic studies show differences in circadian preference, with some individuals tending toward earlier wakefulness and others toward later patterns. These differences likely existed long before industrial schedules standardized mornings. In an ancestral environment, such diversity would not have been corrected. It would have been absorbed into group rhythm. The concept of a fixed minute at which all must rise would have been foreign. Morning unfolded according to light, need, and individual physiology. Even sound in early environments followed gradual escalation. Insects begin first, then birds, then larger animals. This layered increase in environmental noise is distinct from the sharp, repetitive tone of a mechanical alarm. The nervous system responds differently to gradual sensory buildup than to sudden acoustic shock. A slow increase allows cortical networks to activate progressively. A sudden burst triggers startle reflex pathways rooted in brainstem circuitry. For most of our species' history, the auditory environment of morning expanded naturally rather than exploding abruptly. When we place the modern alarm clock against this long backdrop, the contrast becomes precise. The alarm imposes uniformity where there was once variation. It compresses transition where there was once tapering. It replaces environmental gradient with mechanical command. This does not yet mean it is harmful. It simply means it is historically unprecedented on the scale of human evolution. For roughly 200,000 years, human beings woke as part of an ecological system that shifted gradually around them. Temperature rose slowly, light strengthened in increments, sound accumulated in layers, internal hormones adjusted in parallel. Individuals stood up at slightly different times, but all within a shared dawn. The original human morning was not engineered. It was inherited from the rotation of the planet and reinforced by the repetition of countless sunrises. To understand what we were meant for, we must keep this ancestral template in mind before introducing the machinery that would later redefine the start of the day. Inside the human brain, there is a structure no larger than a grain of rice that has kept time far longer than any mechanical device. This cluster of neurons, located in the hypothalamus, coordinates daily rhythms by responding primarily to light. Long before gears and springs were engineered, this internal clock synchronized physiology to the predictable rotation of the Earth. Its existence is not cultural, it is biological, shared across mammals and shaped by deep evolutionary history. To understand whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm, we must first understand how this internal timing system governs the transition from night to day. The cycle it regulates is known as the circadian rhythm, derived from Latin words meaning about a day. It is not perfectly 24 hours on its own. In laboratory conditions without external cues, the human circadian cycle tends to drift slightly longer. This is important. It means that the clock inside the brain expects daily correction from the environment. Light in the morning resets it. Darkness at night allows it to release signals that promote sleep. For early humans living without artificial illumination, this synchronization was automatic. Sunrise provided a consistent anchor. Light entering the retina activates specialized photoreceptors that send information directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. From there, signals travel to regulate hormone release, body temperature, digestion, and alertness. One of the most studied markers of this system is melatonin. Produced by the pineal gland during darkness, melatonin signals the body that it is night. As dawn approaches and light increases, melatonin secretion decreases. This decline does not happen in a single instant. It tapers over time. Parallel to this decline, cortisol levels rise gradually in what researchers call the cortisol awakening response. This rise begins before conscious awareness. In other words, the body prepares to wake before the mind registers the morning. In ancestral environments, this internal preparation aligned with the strengthening of natural light. The circadian system does more than regulate sleep. It influences metabolism, immune activity, and cognitive performance. Core body temperature follows a daily curve, reaching its lowest point in the early morning hours before rising again. Reaction time, memory, and muscle strength vary predictably across the day in coordination with this rhythm. These patterns are observed across cultures and geographic regions, suggesting a deeply rooted biological design. Archaeological and anthropological evidence does not show early human groups overriding this rhythm with fixed mechanical cues. Instead, their activity cycles appear to track daylight duration and seasonal variation. When days were longer, waking occurred earlier relative to sunrise. When nights extended, sleep lengthened. The circadian system is flexible enough to adjust gradually to such changes, but it depends on consistent environmental signals. Its stability was shaped over tens of thousands of generations who rose in response to dawn rather than to sudden noise. Studies in chronobiology demonstrate that abrupt awakenings, especially during deep sleep, can temporarily disrupt coordination between hormonal signals and conscious alertness. This phenomenon, known as sleep inertia, reflects the lag between brain regions reactivating at different speeds. In a natural context, awakening typically coincides with lighter sleep stages, minimizing this lag. The internal clock, guided by early light exposure, reduces the probability of being pulled suddenly from deep restorative phases. Over evolutionary time, this alignment between internal preparation and external dawn would have supported efficient energy use. When measured against roughly 200,000 years of human existence, the circadian system represents an ancient inheritance. Mechanical alarm clocks, by contrast, emerged within the last few centuries. The internal clock evolved to anticipate sunrise, not to obey an arbitrary minute. Before we consider the cultural forces that introduced alarms, we must recognize that the human brain already possessed a timekeeping system deeply attuned to gradual morning light. The internal clock does not operate in isolation. It coordinates a network of peripheral clocks distributed throughout the body, in organs as varied as the liver, heart, lungs, and even individual cells. Each of these tissues expresses clock genes that follow roughly 24-hour cycles of activation and suppression. These genes regulate when enzymes are produced, when glucose is processed, when blood pressure shifts, and when repair mechanisms become active. The central pacemaker in the brain synchronizes this orchestra, but it depends on environmental signals to remain accurate. For most of human evolution, those signals were stable: sunrise, sunset, gradual seasonal change. The body did not merely expect morning light, it relied on it to maintain internal order. When early humans lived in equatorial Africa, day length varied little across the year. The circadian system adapted to that regularity. As populations migrated north and south, day length became more variable, yet the principle remained. Light defined the boundary between biological night and biological day. Without artificial illumination, darkness signaled rest not by social rule, but by physiological necessity. Metabolic pathways slow at night. Insulin sensitivity changes across the day. Immune cell trafficking follows rhythmic patterns. These oscillations are not abstract theories. They are measurable in laboratory settings and observable across cultures. They suggest that waking is not a single event but the visible surface of a deeper biochemical sequence. Toward the end of the night, gene expression patterns begin to shift. Cells increase production of proteins associated with energy mobilization. The adrenal glands gradually release cortisol, which helps regulate blood pressure and glucose availability. This release peaks shortly after natural awakening, not at a random moment. In ancestral settings, this peak coincided with increasing light and the expectation of movement, walking to water sources, preparing tools, scanning the landscape. The alignment between internal activation and environmental visibility minimized wasted effort. The body did not surge into readiness before light allowed safe action. This timing suggests an efficiency shaped by natural selection across tens of thousands of generations. Disruptions to circadian alignment, even in modern controlled studies, are associated with measurable physiological strain. Shift workers who frequently invert their sleep schedules show higher rates of metabolic and cardiovascular disturbance. These findings do not prove that any single alarm is harmful, but they demonstrate that the circadian system is sensitive to timing irregularity. Its stability depends on predictable cues. In an environment without clocks, the strongest cue was dawn. Importantly, the circadian rhythm anticipates morning rather than reacting to it. Hormonal changes begin before sunrise because the internal clock has learned the pattern of light exposure. In laboratory conditions where individuals are deprived of natural light, their rhythms begin to drift. This drift reveals that the system requires daily calibration. Early humans received that calibration without effort, simply by living outdoors or in shelters that did not exclude the sky. Their mornings were anchored in celestial movement. When we compare this long history to the recent introduction of mechanical alarms, the contrast becomes sharper. The circadian system evolved to phase shift gradually, adjusting by minutes across days if necessary. It did not evolve to interpret sudden artificial sound as a primary cue. Acoustic signals can trigger alertness through neural pathways associated with threat detection, but they are not the central regulators of circadian phase. Light holds that role. For approximately 200,000 years, the human body organized itself around the rising sun. Peripheral organs synchronized with the brain's pacemaker, and that pacemaker synchronized with dawn. Waking, therefore, was the culmination of an internal timetable written in genes and reinforced by sky. To ask whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm is to ask whether this ancient coordination can be abruptly replaced without consequence. When the internal clock prepares the body for morning, it does so in layers rather than in a single command. Brain activity begins to shift before consciousness returns. Electrical patterns move from the slow, high-amplitude waves of deep sleep toward faster rhythms associated with lighter sleep. Blood pressure rises gradually. Heart rate increases in anticipation of movement. Even cognitive systems that regulate attention and memory begin to reactivate before the eyes open. In evolutionary time, this layered activation likely carried advantages. It reduced the cost of sudden mobilization and allowed early humans to orient themselves safely within their surroundings. In open landscapes, where visibility and coordination mattered, the ability to transition smoothly from vulnerability to awareness would have supported survival. Importantly, this preparation is timed not only by internal genetic cycles but by the expectation of environmental dawn. The circadian system does more than track 24 hours. It predicts when light will return based on prior exposure. The suprachiasmatic nucleus uses previous day's light signals to anticipate the next morning. This predictive capacity means that the body is not passively waiting for sunrise. It is actively aligning its internal chemistry with an expected increase in light. Studies in chronobiology show that the cortisol awakening response begins shortly before natural waking and peaks within about 30 to 45 minutes after awakening. This pattern is consistent across populations when individuals follow regular sleep schedules aligned with daylight. It reflects a design in which endocrine and neural systems cooperate to create a measured ascent into wakefulness. Over approximately 200,000 years of human existence, this cooperation was reinforced by daily repetition. The planet rotated, light returned, and physiology followed. In contrast, acoustic stimulation is processed through neural circuits that evolved primarily for detecting sudden changes in the environment. possible threats, predator movement, or unexpected social signals. A loud, abrupt sound activates the reticular activating system in the brainstem and can trigger a startle reflex mediated by rapid pathways that bypass slower cortical processing. This reflex is adaptive in contexts of danger. It prepares muscles for immediate action and increases sympathetic nervous system activity. Yet in ancestral mornings, such reflexes were likely reserved for rare events rather than for routine daily transition. If a branch snapped suddenly near a campsite, an abrupt awakening would have been appropriate. But dawn itself did not require shock. It required coordination. When waking aligns with lighter sleep stages and gradual hormonal change, the period known as sleep inertia is typically shorter. Sleep inertia describes the temporary impairment in alertness and performance immediately after awakening. Research indicates that waking from deep slow-wave sleep intensifies this effect. In natural conditions without forced timing, awakenings are statistically more likely to occur during lighter phases toward the end of the night. This does not eliminate inertia entirely, but it reduces the mismatch between internal state and demanded action. In ancestral environments, where early morning tasks involve scanning terrain, communicating with group members, and preparing tools, clarity of perception would have mattered. The circadian system's gradual orchestration helped support that clarity. Genetic variation in circadian timing has been documented in modern populations, suggesting that differences in morning preference have deep roots. Some individuals are predisposed toward earlier natural wake times, others toward later ones. In small foraging groups, this diversity could provide continuous coverage across night and early morning hours without centralized enforcement. The absence of uniform wake times would not have been disorder, it would have been distributed adaptation. The internal clock, therefore, represents not only a timekeeper but a flexible regulator shaped under open skies. For most of our species' history, it calibrated itself against the rising sun, adjusting endocrine signals, neural activation, and metabolic readiness in measured sequence. To replace that sequence with a sudden mechanical cue is to insert a signal into a system that was originally tuned to gradients rather than to alarms. Sleep is not a uniform state from which the mind simply exits. It is a structured cycle composed of repeating stages that alternate throughout the night. In adults, these cycles last approximately 90 minutes, though individual variation exists. Within each cycle, the brain moves through lighter stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep, into deeper slow-wave sleep, and then into rapid eye movement sleep, where dreaming becomes more vivid and brain activity resembles aspects of wakefulness. This architecture is not arbitrary. It is a pattern observed across cultures and environments, suggesting that it reflects an inherited biological design shaped long before artificial timekeeping. To understand the human morning, we must look at how these stages naturally conclude. During the first half of the night, slow-wave sleep dominates. Brain waves are slower and more synchronized. The body repairs tissues, regulates immune function, and consolidates certain forms of memory. As the night progresses, slow-wave sleep gradually decreases, and periods of lighter sleep and REM sleep become more frequent. By the final third of the night, the brain spends proportionally more time in lighter stages. This shift creates windows in which awakening can occur with less disruption. In an environment without imposed timing, many awakenings happen at the boundary between cycles, when the brain has already moved closer to alertness. This timing is not consciously controlled, yet it reflects coordination between circadian signals and sleep architecture. Over roughly 200,000 years of human existence, individuals whose internal rhythms aligned effectively with environmental dawn would have tended to wake during these lighter phases. The gradual decline of melatonin and rise of cortisol described earlier do not operate independently of sleep stages. They influence the probability that the brain will transition out of deeper states as morning approaches. In natural conditions, light entering the eyes, sometimes even before full sunrise, reinforces this transition. The combined effect is that the final cycle of the night often ends near dawn, allowing awakening to feel less abrupt. Anthropological observations of contemporary foraging populations show that individuals frequently experience brief awakenings during the night without distress, then return to sleep until morning light increases. This pattern suggests flexibility rather than rigid continuity. The human sleep system appears adapted to variation, not to a single uninterrupted block ending at a precise minute. When awakening emerges from lighter sleep at the edge of a cycle, cognitive functions recover more smoothly. Reaction time, mood regulation, and motor coordination stabilize faster compared to awakenings from deep, slow-wave sleep. Laboratory studies confirm that forced awakenings during deep sleep intensify sleep inertia, sometimes impairing performance for extended periods. In ancestral environments, where early morning tasks required attention to terrain and social cues, a smoother cognitive transition would have supported safety. The architecture of sleep therefore interacts with environmental light to produce a tapered ascent into wakefulness. It is important to note that this does not imply that early humans never woke abruptly. Environmental threats could interrupt sleep at any stage. However, such interruptions would have been responses to immediate risk, not daily routine. The nervous system is equipped for emergency arousal, but emergency was not the template for morning. The typical pattern, repeated across countless generations, involved sleep cycles thinning toward dawn and consciousness returning as light increased. When we compare this inherited structure to the modern practice of setting an alarm for a fixed time regardless of sleep stage, we begin to see a potential point of tension. The sleep cycle does not know about numbers on a clock. It follows internal timing shaped under natural skies. For most of our species' history, waking occurred at the meeting point between a lightened brain state and a brightening world. That meeting point, not an external command, defined the human morning. Within each 90-minute sleep cycle, the boundary between stages is fluid rather than abrupt. The brain does not leap from the deepest slow-wave state directly into full alertness under natural conditions. Instead, electrical activity shifts gradually. Slow, synchronized waves begin to fragment. Spindles and lighter oscillations appear. Muscle tone subtly increases. The eyes may move beneath closed lids during REM sleep, reflecting internal imagery. Toward morning, the proportion of time spent in slow-wave sleep diminishes, and REM periods lengthen. This pattern is consistent across populations studied in sleep laboratories and suggests a deeply conserved biological design. For most of human history, awakening likely occurred at the edge of one of these lighter stages, particularly as dawn approached and circadian signals reinforced transition. When awakening aligns with lighter sleep, the brain's cortical regions responsible for decision-making and spatial awareness reactivate more quickly. The hippocampus, involved in memory consolidation, has already completed much of its nocturnal processing. The prefrontal cortex, which governs judgment and planning, regains function with less delay compared to abrupt arousal from deep slow-wave sleep. This coordinated reactivation reduces the intensity of sleep inertia. Sleep inertia is not merely grogginess. It reflects measurable impairment in reaction time, attention, and mood during the period immediately following awakening. In laboratory conditions, participants awakened from deep slow-wave sleep show slower cognitive performance and greater disorientation than those awakened from lighter stages. In ancestral environments, where early morning awareness might involve scanning the horizon or responding to subtle environmental cues, minimizing this impairment would have had practical value. The natural thinning of deep sleep toward morning appears to support that need. Circadian rhythm interacts with sleep architecture to make this possible. As melatonin declines and cortisol rises, the brain becomes more likely to transition into lighter states. Body temperature, which reaches its lowest point during the night, begins to climb before spontaneous awakening. This temperature increase correlates with increased alertness. The body, in effect, rehearses wakefulness before consciousness resumes. Over approximately 200,000 years of evolutionary history, this layered preparation would have been repeated across uncountable dawns. The planet turned, the sky brightened, hormonal gradients shifted, and sleep cycles tapered toward completion. In this context, awakening was not a rupture but a culmination. It emerged from the internal rhythm reaching its natural boundary in synchrony with the external environment. Anthropological evidence from contemporary hunter-gatherer groups indicates that wake times cluster around sunrise but do not converge on a single minute. Some individuals rise earlier if environmental conditions demand it. Others remain resting until light strengthens. This variability suggests that sleep cycles are allowed to complete rather than being truncated by uniform command. The architecture of sleep, shaped in open environments without mechanical constraint, accommodates such flexibility. It is important to emphasize that the sleep system evolved to balance restoration with readiness. Deep, slow-wave sleep supports tissue repair and immune regulation. REM sleep contributes to emotional processing and memory integration. Interrupting these stages occasionally is unlikely to cause catastrophic harm, yet making interruption the daily rule introduces a pattern foreign to most of human history. When awakening consistently occurs before a cycle has tapered naturally, the body must shift from deep restoration to active engagement more abruptly than it was typically required to do under ancestral conditions. The human sleep cycle does not incorporate an awareness of clock time. It operates on internal oscillations, synchronized primarily by light. For tens of thousands of years, awakening happened at the seam where these oscillations met dawn. The modern practice of setting a fixed alarm, independent of sleep stage, introduces an external boundary that may or may not align with the cycle's natural edge. To evaluate whether humans were meant to wake to such signals, we must first recognize how precisely sleep architecture and circadian rhythm once collaborated to produce a gentler morning. When a sleep cycle reaches its natural conclusion, the shift into wakefulness resembles the final movement of a gradual ascent rather than the snap of a switch. Brain regions do not activate all at once. Sensory cortices begin to process faint environmental cues even before full consciousness returns. Subtle changes in light intensity pass through the eyelids and are registered by retinal cells. The thalamus, which regulates sensory transmission to the cortex, increases its responsiveness. Muscle tone returns progressively, allowing small movements before deliberate action begins. This layered reactivation has been observed in neurophysiological recordings and reflects the inherent design of human sleep architecture. For most of the approximately 200,000 years our species has existed, this pattern unfolded in the presence of dawn, not in response to mechanical sound. In ancestral settings, the environment offered gradual sensory input. The first signals of morning were often visual and thermal rather than acoustic. The sky brightened incrementally. The temperature of the air shifted. The ground beneath the body began to warm. Sound, when it increased, did so in layers. Insects quieted or intensified. Birds began early calls. Larger animals moved with measured steps. These sensory gradients allowed cortical networks to increase activity in coordination with internal hormonal changes. The nervous system could integrate external information without abrupt sympathetic activation. In this context, awakening was not a reaction to threat but a participation in environmental rhythm. By contrast, a sudden loud sound activates neural pathways associated with startle reflexes. The amygdala and brainstem circuits respond rapidly, often before conscious interpretation occurs. This rapid pathway evolved for immediate survival responses, detecting predators or unexpected danger. It increases heart rate, redirects blood flow to muscles, and heightens vigilance. While effective in emergencies, such activation differs from the layered preparation that typically accompanies natural awakening. When abrupt acoustic stimulation coincides with deep sleep, the mismatch between internal state and external demand can intensify sleep inertia. Studies using electroencephalography show that some brain regions may remain in slow-wave activity for several seconds after abrupt awakening, while others shift quickly toward alertness. This uneven transition can produce temporary disorientation. In ancestral environments, such uneven activation likely occurred primarily in response to rare disturbances, not as a daily routine. The structure of sleep cycles suggests that the system expects a gentle taper rather than a sharp interruption. Anthropological observations of foraging communities indicate that even when individuals must wake early for hunting or travel, they often do so with anticipation shaped by prior light exposure and group rhythm rather than by abrupt mechanical cues. The body's predictive capacity allows cortisol to rise slightly earlier if needed, adjusting across days. This gradual phase-shifting contrasts with the immediacy of a fixed alarm that does not account for the current position within a sleep cycle. Over evolutionary time, the collaboration between circadian rhythm, sleep architecture, and environmental dawn created a morning that was adaptive without being rigid. Individuals varied in exact waking time, yet most awakenings occurred near the end of lighter stages. The brain, having cycled through restorative phases, approached wakefulness in synchrony with increasing light. This synchronization minimized the need for emergency neural pathways during routine transitions. It preserved startle responses for genuine threats rather than daily commencement. When measured against this long backdrop, the mechanical alarm represents a novel input into an ancient system. It can awaken the body at any point within the cycle, regardless of internal preparation. Whether this mismatch carries significant physiological consequences is a question that requires careful evidence rather than assumption. What is clear from evolutionary history is that the human sleep system was shaped under skies that brightened gradually. For tens of thousands of years, mornings were negotiated between brain chemistry and sunrise. The architecture of sleep reveals an expectation of tapering, not of command. To consider whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm is to compare this inherited gradient with a modern signal that bypasses it entirely. Before mechanical clocks divided the day into numbered segments, time was perceived through change rather than measurement. Early human societies did not wake to a fixed hour because the concept of a fixed hour did not exist in daily life. The rising and setting of the sun, the length of shadows, the cooling of evening air, and the migration of animals structured activity more reliably than any abstract unit. For roughly 200,000 years of human history, morning was identified by conditions in the environment, not by reference to a dial. This distinction matters because it reveals how deeply waking was embedded in ecological context rather than imposed from outside it. In hunter-gatherer societies documented by anthropologists, daily schedules remain fluid even today. Work begins when visibility allows it. Travel starts when temperature is tolerable. Rest occurs when light fades or when fatigue accumulates. There is coordination within the group, but it is achieved through shared cues rather than synchronized minutes. The absence of numerical time does not imply disorder. Instead, it reflects attunement to recurring natural patterns. Archaeological evidence from Paleolithic sites indicates seasonal movement and resource tracking rather than rigid daily timetables. Campsites shift with migration of herds or ripening of plants. Morning tasks vary according to need, weather, and opportunity. In such settings, waking is responsive rather than predetermined. The human brain evolved within this flexible framework. Its internal clock aligns with dawn, but it does not require a specific number on a clock face to function. When early agrarian societies later developed more settled patterns of life, time remained closely tied to sunlight. Farmers rose at first light because work depended on it. Monastic communities in medieval Europe structured prayer around canonical hours, yet these hours were still anchored to sunrise and sunset, shifting across seasons. Mechanical clocks existed in some regions, but for centuries they were rare and imprecise. They marked approximate intervals, not exact instants enforced across entire populations. It was not until later technological refinement that clock time began to dominate social organization. This historical shift represents a profound change in how mornings were experienced. In environments without artificial lighting, waking before dawn carried limited practical value. Darkness restricted visibility and increased risk. The body's natural inclination to remain asleep until light strengthened aligned with ecological logic. Over evolutionary time, individuals who conserved energy during darkness and mobilized at dawn would have maintained efficient metabolic patterns. The circadian system described earlier did not evolve in a culture of pre-dawn productivity. It evolved under skies where light determined action. As mechanical timekeeping spread, particularly during the late medieval and early modern periods, hours became standardized across communities. Bells rang to signal communal events. Eventually, portable clocks and personal alarm devices emerged. Yet this transformation occurred within the last few centuries, a brief moment compared to the span of human evolution. For the vast majority of our species' existence, morning was not compressed into a universal instant, shared by thousands rising simultaneously. It was staggered, shaped by geography and season. The difference between equatorial and temperate regions produced varying dawn times, and people adjusted naturally without abstract reference. To grasp the scale of change, Consider that 200,000 years encompass roughly 8,000 human generations. The widespread use of personal alarm clocks spans only a handful of those generations. In evolutionary terms, this is a blink. The human morning began as an event defined by light and landscape. Only recently has it become defined by machinery. Understanding this transition is essential before judging whether our biology was ever intended to obey a fixed mechanical signal at a precise minute regardless of season or internal state. In societies that lived without precise, mechanical timekeeping, coordination did not disappear. It simply relied on shared environmental reference points. Dawn was visible to everyone. The angle of the sun, the direction of shadows, the position of certain stars before sunrise, these were collective markers that required no device to interpret. In many regions, particular birds begin calling at consistent phases of early light, and temperature shifts follow predictable patterns just before sunrise. These cues are not exact to the minute, yet they are reliable enough for coordinated movement. For most of human existence, this level of precision was sufficient. The body did not require synchronization to a uniform second. It required alignment with the cycle of light and darkness that governed survival tasks. Ethnographic accounts from traditional societies show that communal activities often begin after a visible threshold of brightness is reached. Hunters wait until they can distinguish tracks clearly. Gatherers depart when the terrain is safe to navigate. Children wake gradually and are not expected to rise at an identical instant. This pattern reflects a distribution of waking across a span of time, rather than a singular imposed moment. It suggests that early human mornings operated within a window, not at a point. The internal circadian rhythm described earlier aligns naturally with this window. As dawn approaches, hormonal signals shift in preparation, but the exact minute of eye-opening may vary. Such variability does not undermine group function. It may enhance it by allowing staggered alertness. When mechanical clocks became more accurate in the late medieval and early modern periods, they began to reshape this fluidity. Church bells rang at designated hours to signal prayer or work. In urban centres, the regulation of labour gradually tightened around clock time. Yet even then, many rural populations continued to live according to sunlight for centuries. The dominance of precise clock-based schedules accelerated with industrialization, when factories required workers to begin and end shifts simultaneously. The morning transformed from a broad ecological window into a narrow economic threshold. This shift is historically recent when measured against approximately 200,000 years of human evolution. It represents not a small adjustment, but a redefinition of how societies experience the start of the day. Under natural conditions, waking before dawn without environmental necessity would have expended energy inefficiently. Darkness limited safe activity, and food acquisition depended on visibility. The circadian system evolved in harmony with these constraints. Light suppressed melatonin and increased alertness. Darkness promoted rest. The gradual brightening of the sky provided a shared reference for community action without demanding exact simultaneity. Over thousands of generations, this pattern would have reinforced an expectation of gentle transition rather than punctual command. When time is measured by environment, variation is tolerated. When time is measured by machine, variation becomes deviation. The introduction of mechanical precision brought advantages: coordination across distance, reliability in trade, efficiency in production. Yet it also introduced a new relationship between human biology and social expectation. The body's internal clock still follows gradients of light and hormone. The machine demands obedience to fixed increments. For most of our species' history, the question each morning was whether light had returned and whether conditions allowed movement. It was not whether the minute hand had reached a predetermined mark. Recognizing this long ecological heritage provides context for examining the modern practice of setting an alarm that overrides both environmental cues and individual sleep cycles. The gradual replacement of environmental time with mechanical time did not occur overnight. For centuries, the sun remained the primary reference point even as clocks became more common. Early mechanical clocks, appearing in parts of Europe during the late medieval period, were large, imprecise, and often installed in public towers. They marked broad intervals rather than exact minutes. Their purpose was communal coordination signaling, prayer, market hours, or civic events not regulating individual sleep. Most people still rose with daylight because artificial lighting was limited and costly. In rural areas especially, sunrise continued to define the beginning of work well into the early modern era. The body's alignment with dawn remained largely intact. Only gradually did clock time gain authority over natural cues. As technology improved, clocks became smaller and more accurate. Personal timepieces spread among merchants and urban populations. The concept of punctuality began to shape social expectation, yet even then, the structure of daily life often followed light availability. It was not until the expansion of industrial labour in the 18th and 19th centuries that synchronized starting times became essential. Factories required workers to arrive simultaneously to operate machinery efficiently. The morning shifted from a flexible window to a standardized instant. This transition represented a cultural transformation layered upon a biological system that had evolved under different conditions. For approximately 200,000 years, human mornings were governed by environmental change and internal rhythm. The widespread imposition of fixed start times spans only a few centuries, perhaps 10 to 15 generations at most. In evolutionary terms, this is a narrow interval. Biological systems shaped across thousands of generations do not redesign themselves in a handful of centuries. The circadian clock in the brain still anticipates dawn. Sleep architecture still tapers toward lighter stages near morning. Hormonal gradients still rise gradually before spontaneous awakening. These processes do not reference mechanical precision. They respond to light and prior exposure patterns. When societies adopted strict clock-based schedules, individuals began waking at times that might not align with their internal phase. Some adjusted partially over days, but variation remained. Genetic differences in chronotype tendencies toward earlier or later natural wake times did not disappear simply because factory bells rang. Historical records from industrializing cities describe worker fatigue and resistance to early standardized shifts. While economic necessity often prevailed, the tension between biological timing and mechanical expectation was evident. The alarm clock, which later became a common household device, crystallized this shift into a personal ritual. Instead of church bells or factory whistles alone, individuals now set a specific minute for daily awakening regardless of sleep stage or season. Darkness no longer prevented pre-dawn rising because artificial light extended productivity into the night. This extension further separated biological cues from social timing. The morning became less about the Earth's rotation and more about economic coordination. When viewed across the arc of human history, this change is profound. For tens of thousands of years, waking followed gradients, light increasing, temperature shifting, sleep cycles thinning. Within the last few centuries, waking increasingly followed commands, bells, whistles, alarms. The internal clock remained largely the same, but the external framework changed. Understanding this divergence does not require condemnation of modern systems. It requires recognition of scale. The species that now programs alarms once relied solely on the horizon brightening. The shift from environmental dawn to mechanical minute is recent, concentrated, and historically specific. Only by holding these two timelines together, the long evolutionary past and the compressed industrial present, can we evaluate what it means for humans to wake, not because light has returned, but because a device has declared that morning has begun. The invention of mechanical clocks marked more than a technological achievement. It altered how humans related to the passage of the day. Early clock mechanisms, developed in parts of Europe during the 14th century, used weights and escapements to divide time into regulated intervals. At first, these devices were rare and public. They stood in towers, their bells audible across towns. Their primary function was coordination of communal life, announcing prayer, signaling curfew, marking market hours. They did not yet dictate private awakening. Most households continued to rely on sunrise as their cue to begin the day, because artificial lighting was limited and labor was still largely agricultural. The body's internal rhythm remained closely aligned with the natural light cycle. Yet, the existence of a device capable of marking uniform intervals introduced a new abstraction. Time could now be detached from direct observation of the sky. Over generations, this abstraction gained authority. Mechanical precision improved. Minute hands were added. Clocks became portable and increasingly affordable. With this refinement came a subtle shift in perception. Instead of asking whether light was sufficient for activity, communities began asking whether the hour had arrived. This shift did not immediately override biology, but it planted a seed. The human morning began to acquire a numerical identity. In monasteries and early urban centers, regulated hours structured work and devotion. Still, these hours were often tied to solar reference, adjusting slightly across seasons. The full separation between clock time and environmental dawn unfolded gradually. The circadian system within the brain, shaped across approximately 200,000 years of human evolution, did not change in parallel. It continued to anticipate morning light and to coordinate hormonal transitions accordingly. The suprachiasmatic nucleus still required daily calibration by brightness, not by bell. Sleep cycles still tapered toward lighter stages near dawn. The introduction of mechanical time did not rewrite these internal patterns. It overlaid them with external expectation. In agrarian communities, this overlay remained limited for centuries. Farmers rose when visibility allowed fieldwork. Herdsmen moved livestock according to daylight. However, in growing towns and trading centers, commerce demanded increasing synchronization. Meetings, exchanges, and civic duties began to cluster around designated hours rather than around the visible position of the sun alone. This growing emphasis on punctuality represented a cultural adaptation layered upon a biological system evolved for gradient transition. The alarm clock as a personal device emerged later, particularly during the 19th century when industrial labor required workers to arrive at factories simultaneously. Unlike public bells, personal alarms entered private bedrooms. They converted communal time into individual obligation. The difference is significant. A tower bell could be heard by many, but it did not necessarily interrupt deep sleep within enclosed spaces. A bedside alarm, placed near the sleeper, delivered direct acoustic stimulation at a precise minute regardless of sleep stage. This innovation condensed the broader historical shift into a daily ritual enacted millions of times. When measured against the long arc of human existence, the widespread use of personal alarm clocks spans only a small fraction of generations. The species that evolved under open skies, whose mornings were shaped by light and gradual hormonal ascent, now increasingly begins its day by responding to a mechanical signal that ignores both season and sleep architecture. The invention of mechanical time created the possibility of exact synchronization. The alarm clock transformed that possibility into routine. To understand whether humans were meant to wake in this way, we must consider not only the device itself, but the historical forces that made its use nearly universal. As mechanical clocks became more accurate and widely distributed, their influence extended beyond public squares and monasteries into the rhythms of commerce and labor. By the 18th and 19th centuries, industrialization accelerated this transformation. Factories required large numbers of workers to operate machinery in coordinated shifts. Steam engines and later electrical systems functioned most efficiently when human activity aligned precisely. A delay of minutes could disrupt production lines. In this environment, time was no longer a flexible window shaped by daylight. It became a standardized unit measured in exact increments. The morning, once defined by the horizon brightening, was redefined by the start of a shift. This change did not arise from biological need, but from economic organization. For approximately 200,000 years, human beings had risen in response to environmental cues and internal rhythms. Within a few generations, entire populations were expected to wake at the same minute regardless of season or personal chronotype. The social pressure to conform intensified. Factory whistles and church bells signaled collective start times, but as urban populations grew, personal alarm devices became practical tools for ensuring punctuality. By the late 19th century, alarm clocks were manufactured in large quantities, entering ordinary households. Their design was simple yet powerful. A mechanical spring would release stored energy at a preset time, producing a repetitive sound sufficient to rouse a sleeper. Unlike the gradual escalation of birdsong or the soft diffusion of light, this sound was abrupt and uniform. It did not adjust to the individual's sleep stage or to seasonal variation in sunrise. It responded only to the dial. The body's internal clock, however, remained unchanged. The suprachiasmatic nucleus still relied on light for calibration. Sleep cycles still followed their 90-minute oscillations. Hormonal gradients still rose gradually toward natural waking. The imposition of a fixed alarm time introduced the possibility of consistent misalignment between internal phase and external demand. Some individuals, whose natural rhythms aligned with early schedules, adapted more easily. Others, particularly those with later chronotypes, experienced persistent tension between biological timing and imposed hours. Historical accounts from industrial cities describe fatigue among workers required to begin before dawn, especially in winter when sunrise occurred long after factory start times. Artificial lighting made pre-dawn labor possible, but it did not alter the inherited circadian architecture shaped under open skies. The concept of being on time gained moral and economic weight. Punctuality became associated with discipline and reliability. The morning transformed from a physiological event into a test of compliance. The alarm clock embodied this shift at the individual level. It allowed households to internalize industrial timing without relying solely on external bells. In doing so, it transferred the responsibility for synchronization directly into the private sphere of sleep. Over evolutionary time, awakening had been a negotiated process between brain chemistry and the environment. In the industrial era, awakening increasingly became an obligation enforced by mechanical precision. This transition occurred within a few centuries, a narrow slice compared to the thousands of generations that preceded it. The biological systems governing sleep and circadian rhythm did not evolve in anticipation of steam engines or factory shifts. They evolved in relation to dawn. The spread of alarm clocks therefore represents not merely technological convenience, but a structural reorganization of the human morning. Understanding this reorganization is essential before evaluating whether daily abrupt awakening is compatible with the long-established design of the body. Once the alarm clock became a common object in the household, its presence altered more than punctuality. It changed the psychological relationship between the individual and the coming day. In earlier centuries, even under growing industrial influence, morning signals were often external and communal. A bell in a tower, a whistle from a factory yard. These sounds marked shared obligation. The personal alarm, placed beside the bed, individualized that obligation. It transformed the private act of waking into a scheduled commitment to external systems. This shift may appear subtle, yet it represents a profound narrowing of the human morning from a flexible ecological window to a precise mechanical threshold. The device itself was simple: a wound spring, a hammer striking a bell, later an electric buzzer or digital tone. Its function, however, bypassed the gradual orchestration of circadian and sleep cycle processes described earlier. The alarm did not sense hormonal phase, brainwave stage, or environmental light. It executed a command at a predetermined minute. If the sleeper happened to be in lighter sleep near the end of a cycle, the interruption might feel manageable. If the sleeper was in deep, slow-wave sleep, the interruption could be abrupt, provoking heightened sympathetic nervous activity and disorientation. The device did not discriminate. Its authority derived from social expectation rather than biological alignment. Over approximately 200,000 years of evolutionary history, human mornings were shaped by the interaction between internal clocks and natural dawn. In the span of perhaps 5 to 10 generations, the alarm clock became normalized across large parts of the world. This compression of change is striking. Biological evolution operates across thousands of generations. Cultural evolution can transform daily practice within a century. The internal circadian system, still calibrated primarily by light, now coexists with a second system of timing imposed by machinery and economic organization. The two systems are not identical. One follows gradients, the other enforces points. Historical studies of industrial labor reveal that early factory workers often experienced chronic fatigue, particularly when shifts began before sunrise in winter months. Artificial lighting extended productivity into dark hours, but it did not eliminate the physiological signals of night. The alarm clock made it possible to override those signals consistently. In doing so, it reinforced the idea that wakefulness is a decision rather than a biological unfolding. This reframing gradually entered cultural language. Phrases such as getting up on time or oversleeping carry moral weight, yet oversleeping, in biological terms, may simply reflect an internal rhythm not fully aligned with imposed schedule. The normalization of alarm-based waking thus intertwined with values of discipline, efficiency, and productivity. None of these values are inherently harmful. They have enabled complex societies to function, but they were layered onto a nervous system shaped under very different conditions. The alarm clock did not evolve alongside the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It was engineered within historical circumstances that prioritized synchronization over individual variation. As electric lighting spread and urban life intensified, late-night activity increased, further shifting sleep timing. The alarm then became a corrective mechanism, ensuring morning compliance despite shortened or delayed sleep. In this way, it participated in a feedback loop between technology and biology. When measured against the long arc of human existence, this loop is recent and concentrated. The species that once woke with the horizon brightening now frequently wakes to a repetitive tone in darkness. The personal alarm symbolizes the culmination of a historical process that separated morning from the sky and attached it to the dial. To assess whether humans were meant to wake in this manner, we must now turn from history toward the immediate physiological consequences of abrupt awakening. When a sudden alarm sounds in the dark, the first system to respond is not the reflective mind, but the nervous system designed for rapid reaction. The auditory signal travels quickly through the brainstem, activating the reticular activating system and increasing cortical arousal. If the sleeper is in deep, slow-wave sleep, the contrast between internal state and external demand can be sharp. Heart rate accelerates, blood pressure rises. The sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system becomes more active. This response is not inherently harmful. It is part of the body's capacity to mobilize. For most of the approximately 200,000 years of human evolution, however, such abrupt mobilization would have been reserved primarily for unexpected events rather than for the predictable beginning of each day. In ancestral environments, sudden loud sounds were rare and often signaled potential threat. A snapping branch near a campsite or the call of an unfamiliar animal could require immediate alertness. The startle reflex evolved to facilitate rapid orientation and readiness. It bypasses slower cortical evaluation, allowing the body to prepare for action within fractions of a second. This pathway involves the amygdala and brainstem circuits that can elevate heart rate and increase muscle tension almost instantly. When an alarm clock mimics this acoustic pattern daily, it engages neural mechanisms originally shaped for emergency rather than routine transition. The circadian system, by contrast, prepares the body gradually for waking. Cortisol rises before conscious awareness, supporting steady increases in blood glucose and blood pressure. Core body temperature begins to climb from its nocturnal low point. Brain activity shifts toward lighter sleep stages. These processes unfold across tens of minutes. They reflect a coordination between endocrine signals and neural activation that evolved under conditions of gradual dawn. When awakening aligns with these processes, the sympathetic response is moderated. The body moves from rest to readiness along a slope rather than across a step. Research in sleep physiology indicates that abrupt awakenings can produce higher immediate cardiovascular responses compared to spontaneous awakenings, particularly when they occur during deep sleep. While healthy individuals typically tolerate these responses without lasting harm, the difference illustrates how the body distinguishes between gradual transition and sudden demand. The phenomenon of sleep inertia further demonstrates this distinction. After abrupt awakening, especially from slow-wave sleep, cognitive performance and mood can remain impaired for several minutes or longer. Reaction times slow. Decision-making may be less precise. In natural conditions, the thinning of deep sleep toward morning reduces the likelihood of being pulled from the deepest stage. Over evolutionary time, this reduction would have minimized routine cognitive lag at the start of daily tasks. The alarm clock, set to a fixed minute without regard to sleep stage, increases the probability of interrupting deep sleep cycles. The nervous system then compensates through rapid sympathetic activation. This compensation is efficient but not subtle. It resembles a small surge rather than a gentle rise. Across generations shaped by sunrise rather than by mechanical precision, mornings did not typically begin with such surges. They began with increasing light, gradual hormonal change, and distributed waking within groups. The daily repetition of abrupt acoustic stimulation represents a relatively new pattern layered onto an ancient neural architecture. It does not automatically imply dysfunction, yet it differs fundamentally from the gradient-based transitions that characterized most of human history. The nervous system remains capable of both modes. One mode anticipates dawn, the other reacts to signal. To determine whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm, we must consider how often a system evolved for rare emergency activation can be asked to perform that function as a daily routine without subtle cumulative effects. When abrupt awakening occurs, the cardiovascular system adjusts rapidly to support immediate alertness. During deep sleep, heart rate and blood pressure are typically lower, reflecting parasympathetic dominance. Blood vessels are more relaxed, and metabolic demand is reduced. If a loud alarm interrupts this state, the shift toward sympathetic activation can be swift. Heart rate increases within seconds. Blood pressure rises to maintain cerebral perfusion as posture changes from lying to standing. These changes are part of normal physiology, yet their timing differs from the gradual ascent observed in spontaneous waking. In natural conditions aligned with dawn, the body anticipates vertical movement. Cortisol levels rise before full consciousness returns, preparing vascular tone and glucose availability. Core temperature climbs incrementally, reducing the magnitude of adjustment required when standing. Over roughly 200,000 years of human evolution, this anticipatory pattern would have been reinforced by daily repetition. The nervous system and cardiovascular system learn to coordinate with predictable light cues rather than with sudden acoustic signals. Research in chronobiology has shown that the first hour after waking carries distinct physiological characteristics. The cortisol awakening response peaks shortly after spontaneous rising, supporting energy mobilization. Blood pressure also exhibits a morning surge, a phenomenon observed across populations. In individuals who wake naturally, this surge tends to follow internal hormonal gradients. When awakening is forced during deep sleep, the cardiovascular response may become more abrupt. Studies comparing spontaneous and alarm-induced awakenings indicate differences in immediate heart rate variability and blood pressure trajectories, particularly when the alarm interrupts slow-wave sleep. While healthy individuals generally adapt without lasting injury, these findings illustrate that the mode of waking influences the pattern of physiological transition. Over evolutionary time, abrupt cardiovascular activation would have been associated with threat detection rather than routine commencement of daily labor. The sympathetic nervous system evolved to mobilize the body in response to danger-predator presence, sudden environmental disturbance. In ancestral settings, such activation would have been intermittent, the daily rhythm of life centered on gradual dawn. The introduction of alarm-based waking converts a signal pathway shaped for rare events into a predictable daily trigger. The body remains capable of performing this shift, yet its design history suggests that gradual preparation was the norm. It is also important to consider posture and movement. Rising from sleep involves a change in blood distribution as gravity acts on the body. Under gradual waking, this change occurs as awareness increases and muscle tone returns progressively. Under abrupt awakening, the impulse to silence the alarm may prompt rapid movement before full stabilization of cardiovascular reflexes. This can produce brief dizziness in some individuals, reflecting the time required for baroreceptor mechanisms to adjust. Such effects are usually mild, yet they highlight the delicate coordination between neural and vascular systems during the transition from rest to activity. Anthropological records from traditional societies describe mornings beginning with stretching, tending to embers, or quiet conversation before more demanding tasks commence. These behaviors align with a gradual cardiovascular shift. The mechanical alarm, by contrast, often compresses the interval between sleep and obligation. The body's internal clock still operates on gradients, but the external schedule may not allow those gradients to unfold fully. When measured against thousands of generations shaped by sunrise, the daily repetition of sudden cardiovascular activation represents a historically recent pattern. It does not necessarily cause immediate pathology, yet it differs from the ancestral template. Understanding this difference is essential before concluding whether routine alarm-based waking harmonizes with the systems that evolved to greet the day through light and incremental change. Beyond the immediate changes in heart rate and blood pressure, abrupt awakening also influences how the brain and body coordinate in the first moments of consciousness. During deep sleep, certain cortical regions, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, show reduced metabolic activity. These regions are involved in judgment, impulse control, and complex decision-making. When waking occurs gradually near the end of a sleep cycle, metabolic activity in these areas increases progressively. Sensory systems regain sensitivity, and orientation to environment unfolds step by step. Under such conditions, the mind often transitions through brief moments of quiet awareness before full engagement with external demands. Over roughly 200,000 years of human existence, this gradual neural ramping would have accompanied dawn in open environments where immediate complex decisions were rarely required in the first seconds of waking. An abrupt alarm can compress this process. The startle response activates subcortical circuits rapidly, but higher-order cortical areas may lag behind for several seconds. This mismatch can produce transient confusion, irritability, or slowed reasoning, a manifestation of sleep inertia. Neuroimaging studies indicate that after forced awakening from slow-wave sleep, some regions of the brain continue to display sleep-like activity, even as others shift toward wakefulness. The body may stand, silence the alarm, or reach for light, while parts of the cortex are still recalibrating. In natural settings, the tapering of sleep cycles toward morning reduces the probability of this uneven activation. The circadian rise in cortisol and temperature supports a more synchronized transition. It is important to distinguish between occasional abrupt awakenings and daily routine. Evolution equipped humans to respond effectively to sudden disturbances. If a predator approached a campsite or an environmental hazard emerged, rapid mobilization was adaptive. Such events, however, were unpredictable and infrequent. The typical morning, repeated across thousands of generations, unfolded in parallel with sunrise. The brain did not need to interpret loud mechanical sound as a daily cue. Instead, it integrated increasing light, subtle environmental noise, and internal hormonal change. This integration allowed cognitive systems to regain function in coordination with physical readiness. Modern schedules often require immediate engagement, with complex tasks driving in traffic, making decisions, responding to digital communication within minutes of awakening. When awakening is abrupt and occurs during deep sleep, the lag in higher cortical activation may overlap with these demands. Research on sleep inertia shows that cognitive impairment can persist for up to 30 minutes or longer in some conditions, particularly when sleep deprivation is present. This does not imply inevitable harm, but it underscores the delicate choreography of neural reactivation that evolved under slower transitions. Anthropological observations of traditional communities describe mornings that begin with gradual social interaction, tending fires, or preparing simple tasks before embarking on more demanding activities. These patterns align with the brain's need for staged activation. The mechanical alarm shortens this interval. It delivers a precise cue that may not correspond to the internal phase of the sleep cycle or to the current state of cortical reactivation. Over evolutionary time, waking was embedded within an ecological and social buffer that allowed cognitive systems to come online steadily. The alarm removes much of that buffer. It does not abolish the brain's ability to adapt, but it changes the sequence. When measured against the long history of dawn-based waking, the daily practice of abrupt acoustic arousal introduces a novel demand on neural coordination. To determine whether humans were meant to wake this way, we must consider not only immediate physiological reactions, but also how repeated compression of transition might influence long-term alignment between internal clocks and external expectations. Over the course of human history, waking did not occur in isolation from the social group. In small bands of hunter-gatherers, individuals slept in proximity, often within a shared camp space. Nighttime vigilance rotated naturally. At any given hour, at least one person might be lightly awake, tending a fire or responding to distant sounds. This pattern, documented among several contemporary foraging populations, suggests that sleep and waking were distributed across the group rather than synchronized to a single instant. Morning, therefore, was not a simultaneous event imposed upon everyone at once. It was a gradual emergence of activity within a shared environment. As light increased, more members of the group stirred. Conversation began softly. Movement unfolded incrementally. This social gradient complemented the biological gradient of circadian transition. For approximately 200,000 years, such distributed waking would have reduced the need for uniform abrupt arousal. The group's survival did not depend on every individual standing at the same minute. Diversity in chronotype, natural variation in early or late preference, could even provide advantages. Those inclined to wake earlier might observe environmental changes sooner. Those inclined to remain awake later into the night might contribute to vigilance. Genetic studies in modern populations reveal persistent variation in circadian timing, suggesting that this diversity has deep evolutionary roots. In a flexible ecological system, such variation is accommodated rather than suppressed. The internal clock in each brain calibrates to light exposure and prior patterns, but it does not require exact synchronization with every other member of the group. Mechanical alarm clocks, by contrast, encourage simultaneous awakening within households and across communities. When factories and schools operate at fixed hours, individuals are required to align their waking times closely. The social buffer of staggered rising diminishes. Instead of waking gradually as others stir, many people wake alone to a device in darkness, often before others in the household. The social context of morning narrows. Anthropological accounts describe early mornings in traditional communities as periods of low-intensity interaction, quiet speech, shared preparation of simple food, slow transition into activity. These behaviors mirror the brain's gradual reactivation described earlier. The mechanical alarm can compress this social gradient into a sharper boundary. It may not eliminate social interaction, but it often reduces the interval between awakening and obligation. The evolution of human social systems occurred under conditions in which time was referenced to environmental cues rather than to synchronized minutes. Cooperation did not require universal punctuality to a specific second. It required overlap and shared awareness of light and season. Over thousands of generations, this pattern reinforced tolerance for variation in waking times within a common window defined by dawn. The rise of industrial and post-industrial schedules introduced a new demand: precision. Schools begin at set hours. Transportation systems operate on timetables. Digital communication expects immediate response. The alarm clock becomes the personal instrument that aligns individuals to this precision. Yet the underlying biological architecture, circadian rhythm, sleep cycles, distributed chronotypes remains rooted in a different historical context. When we consider whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm, it is necessary to include this social dimension. The original human morning was collective yet staggered, shaped by light and shared space. The modern morning often begins in isolation, defined by a device and by the expectation of immediate compliance. The contrast is not only physiological, but communal. It reflects a shift from ecological coordination to mechanical synchronization, layered upon a species whose neural and social systems evolved under open skies. As human societies became more complex and densely populated, the distribution of waking began to narrow. Agricultural communities still depended heavily on daylight, yet seasonal labor sometimes required coordinated effort at specific moments harvest before weather changed, irrigation at precise intervals. Even then, sunrise remained the primary anchor. Variation in individual waking persisted because environmental light, not mechanical precision, defined readiness. Over roughly 200,000 years of evolutionary development, the social structure of morning allowed overlap rather than uniformity. Each person's internal clock, shaped by genetic predisposition and prior light exposure, contributed to a staggered pattern that supported group function without demanding identical timing. The transition to industrial and urban life compressed this variability. Schools, offices, and transportation networks operate according to fixed schedules. Commuting patterns require synchronization across large populations. The morning rush hour is a product of this synchronization. When thousands rise at nearly the same minute, social systems align efficiently, but biological diversity may be constrained. Chronotype research indicates that some individuals are naturally inclined toward earlier sleep and wake times, while others function optimally later. These tendencies are influenced by genetic variation in clock genes and by developmental stage. Adolescents, for example, often display later natural sleep phases compared to older adults. In ancestral contexts, such variation would have been integrated into group rhythm. In modern contexts with standardized early start times, individuals with later chronotypes may experience persistent misalignment. This misalignment is sometimes referred to as social jet lag, the discrepancy between internal circadian phase an externally imposed schedule. Social jet lag does not arise from travel across time zones. It emerges from daily divergence between biological timing and social expectation. Alarm clocks play a central role in this divergence. They enable waking at hours that may precede natural circadian readiness, particularly when evening light exposure delays melatonin onset. Anthropological observations from contemporary forager societies show limited evidence of chronic early rising in darkness. Activities typically follow visible light. The contrast with modern urban environments, where artificial lighting extends wakefulness late into the night while alarm clocks enforce early rising, is striking. The combination can shorten sleep duration and increase reliance on abrupt awakening. From an evolutionary perspective, the compression of waking into a narrow synchronized window represents a recent cultural adaptation. Biological systems shaped over thousands of generations do not instantly recalibrate to such compression. The internal circadian clock remains sensitive to light exposure patterns and genetic variation. When individuals are required to wake at a fixed early hour regardless of chronotype, some adapt partially over time, yet residual misalignment may persist. This does not imply that modern schedules are inherently harmful. They have enabled large-scale coordination essential to contemporary life. It does suggest, however, that the uniformity of waking demanded by industrial and post-industrial systems differs fundamentally from the distributed mornings of ancestral communities. The alarm clock is the instrument that bridges this gap at the individual level. It translates collective timetable into personal command. Over approximately 200,000 years, human mornings unfolded across a gradient of light and social stirrings. Within a few centuries, that gradient has narrowed into synchronized departure times and standardized start hours. To understand whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm, we must consider how this narrowing interacts with the inherent diversity of circadian timing embedded within our species. When large populations align their mornings to fixed schedules, the social consequences extend beyond punctuality. The narrowing of wake times reshapes patterns of interaction, work distribution, and even perception of normalcy. In ancestral groups, staggered waking allowed continuity of awareness through the night and early dawn. Some individuals would stir earlier, rekindling embers or observing changes in the landscape. Others would rise later, after deeper phases of sleep had completed. This variability supported both safety and flexibility. Over roughly 200,000 years of human existence, such distributed timing was not a flaw but a feature of social organization. The group did not require uniform emergence at a single minute to function effectively. Modern urban life, however, compresses this distribution. Public transportation systems operate at designated times. Schools begin at standardized hours. Workplaces expect presence within narrow windows. This compression reduces tolerance for natural variation in chronotype. Those whose internal clocks incline them toward later waking may repeatedly rely on alarms to meet expectations. Over days and weeks, this reliance can create a persistent gap between biological night and social morning. The concept of social jet lag illustrates this gap. It reflects the difference between an individual's internal circadian phase and externally imposed schedule, even when both occur in the same geographic time zone. Researchers associated chronic social jet lag with measurable effects on sleep duration and subjective well-being. While the body can partially adapt to consistent schedules, adaptation may not eliminate underlying chronotype differences. In pre-industrial contexts, such differences would have been absorbed into group rhythm without moral judgment. The notion of oversleeping carried less weight when morning tasks followed light rather than clock. The mechanical alarm, by contrast, frames waking as compliance. Failure to rise at the designated minute can be interpreted as irresponsibility rather than as biological variance. This shift introduces psychological dimensions alongside physiological ones. The morning becomes a test of alignment with collective timetable. The internal circadian system, shaped across thousands of generations under open skies, does not inherently categorize later waking as deviance. It responds to light exposure and genetic predisposition. When artificial lighting extends evening activity, melatonin onset may be delayed. If alarm clocks enforce early rising regardless of this delay, sleep duration may shorten. The interaction between late-night light exposure and early alarm-based waking is a distinctly modern pattern. Anthropological observations from societies with limited artificial light show sleep onset, occurring closer to sunset and waking near sunrise. Even without mechanical enforcement, the spread of electric lighting and digital devices has expanded nighttime beyond ancestral norms, while the alarm ensures morning punctuality despite this extension. The result is a compression of sleep opportunity and a reduction in flexibility of waking. This does not mean that uniform schedules are inherently destructive. They enable large-scale coordination, economic stability, and educational systems. Yet when evaluated against the long arc of human evolution, the contrast is clear. For tens of thousands of years, morning unfolded across a social gradient shaped by light and individual variation. Within a few centuries, that gradient has been condensed into synchronized minutes enforced by personal devices. The alarm clock stands at the intersection of biological diversity and social precision. To ask whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm is also to ask how a species adapted for distributed dawn adjusts to a world that demands simultaneous emergence. The expansion of artificial light marked another turning point in the human relationship with morning. For most of the approximately 200,000 years that Homo sapiens have existed, darkness after sunset imposed clear biological limits. Fire extended visibility slightly, but its glow was localized and dim compared to modern electric lighting. Night signaled physiological descent into rest. Melatonin secretion rose in response to fading light, and activity diminished accordingly. Sleep onset typically followed sunset within a few hours, varying by season and latitude. Morning, in turn, aligned closely with sunrise because little incentive existed to remain awake deep into the night. The circadian system, shaped under these constraints, evolved in stable dialogue with the natural light-dark cycle. The introduction of widespread electric lighting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries disrupted this dialogue. Artificial illumination extended wakefulness far beyond sunset, enabling work, entertainment, and social interaction at hours previously limited by darkness. Light-emitting diodes and digital screens intensified this effect by emitting blue wavelengths known to suppress melatonin. When individuals are exposed to bright light late in the evening, melatonin onset can be delayed. The internal clock interprets this exposure as an extension of day. Sleep may begin later, even if the following morning's schedule remains fixed. Over evolutionary time, the circadian system relied on predictable patterns of darkness to signal night. Electric light altered those signals within a few generations. The body retains its sensitivity to light intensity and wavelength. The suprachiasmatic nucleus continues to adjust phase according to exposure patterns. When evening light delays circadian phase but an alarm enforces early rising, the result can be shortened sleep duration and increased reliance on abrupt awakening. Anthropological studies of communities with limited access to electricity reveal sleep timing that tracks sunset more closely than in industrialized societies. These communities typically rise near sunrise without mechanical assistance. Their sleep duration varies seasonally in accordance with day length. This pattern resembles what likely characterized much of human history. In contrast, urban populations often experience a dissociation between internal biological night and social night. Evening activities extend under artificial light, while morning obligations remain fixed. The alarm clock becomes the tool that reconciles these two systems by compelling wakefulness at a designated minute. From a historical perspective, this sequence is compressed. For thousands of generations, night was dark and morning was bright. Within a century, light became available at any hour. The circadian clock, however, still depends primarily on light exposure to calibrate its phase. It cannot distinguish between sunlight and the glow of a screen except by intensity and wavelength. The combination of late-night light and early alarm-based waking creates a pattern that differs significantly from the ancestral template. The internal clock may be shifted later, while the social clock remains early. Over time, individuals may adapt partially, but complete alignment is not guaranteed, especially for those with later chronotypes. The modern morning is therefore shaped not only by mechanical timekeeping but also by artificial manipulation of night. To evaluate whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm, we must consider how the extension of light into darkness interacts with the inherited circadian architecture shaped under natural skies. Artificial light does not merely extend the day, it reshapes the timing signals that the circadian system relies upon. The human retina contains specialized cells that are particularly sensitive to short wavelength blue light. These cells project directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the central circadian pacemaker. In natural environments, blue-enriched light is most abundant in the morning sky. Exposure to this light advances circadian phase, reinforcing earlier wake times aligned with sunrise. After sunset, the spectrum of natural light shifts toward longer wavelengths, and overall intensity declines. This shift allows melatonin to rise and signals the body that biological night has begun. For approximately 200,000 years of human evolution, this spectral pattern repeated daily with minimal variation, except for seasonal changes in day length. Electric lighting compresses these natural transitions. Indoor light at night can reach intensities sufficient to suppress melatonin, especially when individuals are exposed to screens at close range. Unlike firelight, which emits predominantly longer wavelengths and lower intensity, modern LEDs often emit significant blue light. When exposure occurs late in the evening, the circadian clock may interpret the signal as extended daylight. Melatonin onset can be delayed, pushing the internal biological night later. If the morning alarm remains fixed, sleep opportunity narrows. The body may still be in a biological night phase when the alarm sounds. Laboratory studies have demonstrated that even moderate evening light exposure can shift circadian phase by measurable amounts. Participants exposed to bright light before bedtime show delayed melatonin secretion and altered sleep timing compared to those in dim light. These shifts are not hypothetical, they are observable physiological responses. In ancestral contexts, extended exposure to bright light after sunset was rare. Firelight did not replicate the intensity or spectral composition of electric lighting. As a result, sleep timing more closely followed the natural cycle of darkness. Anthropological observations from communities without widespread electricity show melatonin onset occurring earlier in the evening relative to clock time, and spontaneous waking occurring near sunrise without mechanical intervention. In modern urban environments, the combination of late light exposure and early alarm-based waking can produce a pattern of chronic partial sleep restriction. Individuals may not perceive severe deprivation, yet average sleep duration may fall below the amount supported by their internal rhythm. The alarm clock becomes the instrument that compensates for delayed circadian phase by enforcing wakefulness despite incomplete alignment. Over evolutionary time, the circadian system was calibrated by celestial light cues that changed gradually. Within a century, artificial lighting has altered these cues on a global scale. The internal clock remains sensitive to light intensity and timing. It cannot adapt instantly to arbitrary patterns of exposure. When evening light delays internal night and morning alarms demand early rising, the transition from sleep to wakefulness may occur during a phase when melatonin levels remain elevated and body temperature has not yet begun its natural ascent. This misalignment can intensify sleep inertia and subjective fatigue. It represents a divergence between biological timing and social scheduling that would have been uncommon across most of human history. To assess whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm, we must consider not only the sound that interrupts sleep, but also the light environment that shapes the internal clock before the alarm ever rings. When artificial light extends deep into the evening and the alarm enforces early, rising, a new pattern emerges that would have been rare across most of human history. Repeated truncation of biological night. Sleep duration becomes compressed not because the body requires less rest, but because social schedules demand wakefulness at fixed hours regardless of circadian phase. Over roughly 200,000 years, human sleep likely expanded and contracted seasonally, yet it remained broadly synchronized with the duration of darkness. In equatorial regions, nights are relatively stable in length. In higher latitudes, winter nights are longer, and sleep opportunity may have increased accordingly. The internal clock, shaped under these conditions, retains flexibility to adjust gradually across seasons. It does not anticipate consistent late-night light combined with fixed early alarms. In modern environments, evening activities often extend under bright indoor lighting and digital screens. The circadian pacemaker interprets this light as continued day, delaying melatonin secretion and shifting the internal night later. If the following morning's wake time is set by alarm rather than by natural light, sleep may be curtailed before the final cycles have tapered naturally. Repeated across days and weeks, this pattern can reduce average sleep duration. Research in sleep epidemiology indicates that many adults in industrialized societies report sleeping fewer hours than recommended for optimal functioning. While individual needs vary, the discrepancy between internal circadian timing and external schedule contributes to this reduction. The alarm clock, in this context, serves as the instrument that resolves the conflict in favor of social time. The body's hormonal gradients may not yet have completed their nocturnal descent when the alarm sounds. Melatonin levels may remain elevated, and core temperature may still be near its lowest point. Awakening under these conditions can feel heavier than spontaneous rising near sunrise. Laboratory studies demonstrate that awakening at earlier circadian phases before the body has reached its natural readiness can increase subjective sleepiness and prolong sleep inertia. These findings align with the understanding that the circadian system evolved to align waking with environmental light. Anthropological evidence from communities with limited electricity suggests that when evening light is minimal, sleep onset occurs earlier, and spontaneous waking often coincides with dawn. In such contexts, the need for mechanical enforcement is reduced because biological and environmental timing converge. The modern pattern of late-night illumination, followed by early alarm, disrupts this convergence. It introduces a regular misalignment between internal night and social morning. Over evolutionary time, such chronic misalignment would have been uncommon. Occasional disruptions, travel, environmental threat, seasonal change would have occurred, but not the daily compression of sleep by artificial light and mechanical wake times. This pattern is historically concentrated within the last century, a brief interval relative to the thousands of generations that preceded it. The human circadian system remains calibrated primarily by light exposure. The alarm clock, while efficient in enforcing punctuality, does not adjust for circadian phase or sleep architecture. When light and alarm operate in opposition, light delaying sleep, alarm advancing wake, the body is asked to reconcile two divergent signals. Understanding this dynamic is essential for evaluating whether routine alarm-based waking harmonizes with the inherited design of a species shaped under gradual sunsets and gradual dawns. Across different regions of the world, not all human communities have adopted identical waking patterns. Variations in geography, culture, and access to technology continue to shape how mornings unfold. In equatorial zones where sunrise and sunset remain relatively stable year-round, communities with limited exposure to artificial lighting often display sleep schedules closely aligned with the light-dark cycle. Anthropological research among small-scale societies has documented sleep onset occurring a few hours after sunset and waking near sunrise, with little reliance on mechanical devices. In these contexts, dawn itself serves as a reliable signal. The internal circadian clock, calibrated by consistent light exposure, requires minimal external enforcement. For approximately 200,000 years, this alignment between environmental dawn and spontaneous waking likely characterized most human experience. In contrast, populations living at higher latitudes encounter significant seasonal variation in day length. In winter, sunrise may occur late in the morning, and darkness extends long into daylight hours. In summer, daylight may persist late into the night. Even before the advent of mechanical timekeeping, such variation required adaptive flexibility. Historical accounts from northern agrarian societies indicate adjustments in daily routines across seasons. Work began when visibility allowed, but timing shifted naturally with sunrise and sunset. Sleep duration often lengthened during darker months and shortened during brighter seasons. The circadian system, though influenced by latitude, remained anchored primarily to light cues rather than to fixed clock hours. The introduction of standardized time zones and national schedules reduced this seasonal flexibility. Modern societies often maintain consistent work and school start times throughout the year, even when sunrise shifts by several hours across seasons. Alarm clocks enable this consistency. They override the natural variation in dawn that once guided activity. In regions where winter sunrise occurs long after social morning begins, individuals may wake in complete darkness for months at a time. This pattern would have been unusual across most of evolutionary history, except in specific high-latitude populations. Even in those populations, pre-industrial life likely allowed more seasonal adjustment than contemporary schedules permit. Research on seasonal affective patterns demonstrates that light exposure influences mood and energy levels. The circadian clock responds differently to varying day lengths, adjusting hormonal rhythms gradually. When social schedules ignore these seasonal shifts, alarm-based waking may occur at circadian phases misaligned with internal readiness, particularly during darker months. The contrast between equatorial and high-latitude patterns illustrates that human biology retains sensitivity to environmental variation. It does not operate independently of light. Over tens of thousands of generations, adaptation to local conditions occurred gradually. Yet the widespread imposition of uniform work hours across entire nations compresses regional differences into standardized morning routines. The alarm clock functions as the device that enforces this standardization at the level of the individual. To ask whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm is therefore also to consider geographic diversity. In environments where dawn remains visible and schedules flexible, mechanical enforcement may be less necessary. In environments shaped by industrial uniformity, alarms become central. The evolutionary template, however, remains rooted in light-driven variation rather than in seasonally invariant minutes on a dial. Beyond geography and season, cultural practices have historically shaped how mornings unfold. In many pre-industrial societies, sleep was not always confined to a single uninterrupted block. Historical records from early modern Europe describe patterns sometimes referred to as segmented sleep, in which individuals slept for several hours after sunset, woke briefly during the night for quiet activity, and then returned to sleep until dawn. This pattern, while not universal, suggests that human sleep can accommodate variation without rigid enforcement. In environments without artificial lighting, extended darkness allowed flexibility. People adjusted their routines according to light, temperature, and need rather than to fixed clock times. The morning, in such settings, still coincided with increasing light, even if nighttime contained brief awakenings. The circadian system, shaped across approximately 200,000 years, does not demand a single specific structure of sleep. It requires alignment with light-dark cycles and sufficient duration of rest. Anthropological research among contemporary forager societies also reveals variability in sleep timing. Some groups demonstrate monophasic sleep, one consolidated period, while others exhibit patterns that include short daytime rest. Importantly, waking tends to align with sunrise or with environmental cues rather than with mechanical signals. This suggests that the internal clock and sleep architecture retain flexibility across cultures, provided they remain anchored to natural light. Modern industrial societies, however, tend to favor consolidated nighttime sleep followed by early synchronized morning start times. The alarm clock reinforces this structure by enforcing a specific endpoint regardless of internal phase. When cultural norms prioritize productivity beginning at uniform hours, sleep timing becomes constrained. The diversity of historical patterns illustrates that human sleep is adaptable, but adaptation historically occurred within the bounds of environmental cues. Even in cultures where nighttime awakenings were common, final rising typically corresponded with dawn. The introduction of electric lighting altered these boundaries. Evening activities extended later, compressing nighttime and reducing the interval between sleep onset and alarm-based waking. The combination of delayed sleep and fixed early schedules reduces tolerance for natural variation. Anthropological evidence indicates that in societies without widespread electricity, average sleep duration may align more closely with the duration of darkness, though not necessarily extending to the full length of night. The key distinction is that final waking generally corresponds to environmental light rather than to arbitrary minute. The mechanical alarm interrupts this alignment by imposing a socially determined endpoint. Over evolutionary time, waking was embedded in cultural practices that revolved around sunrise, not in systems that demanded identical emergence across entire populations. While cultural variation in sleep structure existed, the anchor remained the sky. The alarm clock represents a cultural instrument that detaches the endpoint of sleep from that anchor. It enforces uniformity across households regardless of individual chronotype or seasonal change. To evaluate whether humans were meant to wake to such signals, it is essential to recognize that cultural flexibility historically operated within ecological constraints. The internal clock evolved under light-driven patterns, and cultural forms of sleep adjusted around those patterns rather than replacing them. As cultures modernized and transportation networks expanded, time itself became standardized across vast territories. The introduction of coordinated railway schedules in the 19th century required consistent timekeeping across cities and regions. Before this shift, local solar time varied from place to place, adjusted to the position of the sun at noon. With the spread of railroads, such variation created logistical confusion. Standard time zones were established to synchronize movement across long distances. This innovation improved efficiency and safety, yet it further separated daily life from direct environmental reference. Morning no longer corresponded solely to local sunrise. It corresponded to a national timetable. The alarm clock functioned within this broader framework, ensuring that individuals aligned their waking with standardized time rather than with the sky above them. For approximately 200,000 years, human waking had been anchored to the light available at a specific geographic location. Under standard time systems, two communities at different longitudes within the same time zone might experience sunrise at noticeably different clock times, yet share identical work start hours. In some regions, this divergence remains small. In others, especially near the edges of time zones, sunrise may occur significantly later or earlier relative to social morning. The internal circadian clock, however, responds to actual light exposure, not to administrative boundaries. When standardized schedules require waking before local sunrise, particularly during winter months, individuals may rely heavily on alarms to initiate their day. This reliance reflects a further abstraction of time from environmental cues. The shift toward global synchronization accelerated in the 20th century with telecommunication and digital technology. Work and communication can now begin independent of local daylight, connecting individuals across continents in real time. The expectation of early responsiveness has intensified. The alarm clock becomes not merely a tool for local punctuality, but a gateway to participation in global networks. Over evolutionary time, such global synchronization would have been unimaginable. Human groups operated within the constraints of their immediate environment. Sunrise in one region had no bearing on activity in another distant region. The internal clock evolved to respond to local light-dark cycles, not to transnational schedules. The compression of waking into a globally coordinated minute represents a cultural innovation layered upon a biological system shaped under localized skies. Research in chronobiology demonstrates that misalignment between social time and solar time can influence sleep duration and circadian phase. When work schedules consistently require waking before local sunrise, especially during darker seasons, individuals may experience reduced alignment between internal rhythms and external demands. The alarm clock mediates this misalignment by enforcing wakefulness according to standardized time. This does not render modern coordination invalid. It enables complex societies to function, yet it highlights the magnitude of change relative to ancestral conditions. For tens of thousands of years, waking followed gradients of light specific to each landscape. Within the last 2 centuries, waking has increasingly followed standardized minutes that may not reflect those gradients. The species whose internal clock was tuned to the rotation of the Earth now often wakes according to administrative zones and economic schedules. To ask whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm is also to ask how a biological system rooted in local dawn adapts to a world governed by standardized global time. When we consider the question of adaptation, it is necessary to distinguish between cultural change and biological evolution. Cultural systems can transform within decades. Biological evolution, shaped by natural selection acting across generations, operates far more slowly. Homo sapiens has existed for approximately 200,000 years, encompassing thousands of generations exposed to dawn as the primary signal for waking. The widespread use of mechanical alarm clocks spans little more than a century in many regions, perhaps 5 or 6 generations. This contrast in timescale is central to understanding whether the human organism could have evolved specifically to accommodate alarm-based waking. Evolutionary adaptation requires differential reproductive success linked to heritable traits. For alarm-based waking to shape biology directly, individuals who tolerate abrupt awakening would need to have a consistent reproductive advantage over those who do not. Given the relatively short historical window and the complexity of modern healthcare and social structures, it is unlikely that significant genetic change has occurred specifically in response to alarm clocks. The circadian architecture governed by clock genes and neural structures such as the suprachiasmatic nucleus remains largely consistent with patterns observed before industrialization. Studies comparing populations across different societies reveal similar fundamental sleep stages and circadian mechanisms. While minor variations in chronotype exist and may reflect both genetic and environmental influences, there is no evidence of a rapid evolutionary shift specifically toward tolerance of mechanical alarms. Instead, what we observe is behavioral adaptation. Individuals learn to anticipate alarm times. Some may experience lighter sleep toward expected wake times due to conditioning. Over repeated exposure, the brain can associate a particular hour with waking, sometimes leading to spontaneous arousal shortly before the alarm. This phenomenon reflects neural plasticity rather than genetic evolution. It demonstrates the brain's capacity to predict routine events, but it does not indicate that the underlying circadian design has been rewritten. Anthropological comparisons between populations with differing access to technology show that fundamental sleep architecture persists. REM and non-REM cycles remain intact. Hormonal gradients follow similar patterns relative to light exposure. These consistencies suggest that the biological template shaped across tens of thousands of years has not been fundamentally altered by a few generations of industrial scheduling. Cultural evolution has modified the environment in which the body operates, but the body itself retains its ancestral framework. This distinction is crucial. Humans can adapt behaviorally to alarm-based waking, just as they adapt to many modern conditions. Yet, adaptation at the level of practice does not necessarily imply full biological harmony. The internal clock continues to respond primarily to light cues. The nervous system still differentiates between gradual transition and abrupt stimulation. When the alarm enforces wakefulness at a time misaligned with circadian phase, the body compensates through sympathetic activation and cognitive adjustment. These compensations are effective in the short term, but they represent accommodation rather than redesign. Over approximately 200,000 years, human mornings were shaped by environmental dawn and distributed social rhythms. The alarm clock, introduced within a narrow historical window, represents a cultural overlay rather than an evolutionary recalibration. To evaluate whether humans were meant to wake to such signals, we must acknowledge this disparity in timescale. Biological systems evolve slowly. Technologies can reshape daily life rapidly. The question, then, is not whether humans can wake to alarms, they clearly can, but whether the underlying design was ever configured with that expectation in mind. Although biological evolution has not had sufficient time to reshape human circadian architecture in response to alarm clocks, the brain exhibits remarkable capacity for learning and anticipation. When an individual sets an alarm for the same time each morning, neural circuits gradually form an association between that specific hour and waking. Studies in sleep research have documented instances in which people awaken spontaneously a few minutes before a regularly scheduled alarm. This anticipatory awakening is thought to involve conditioning processes in which the brain predicts the expected stimulus. Cortisol levels may begin to rise slightly earlier when a fixed wake time is maintained consistently. Such adjustments demonstrate plasticity within the existing circadian framework rather than the creation of a new biological system. Over approximately 200,000 years, the internal clock evolved to predict sunrise based on patterns of light exposure. In modern contexts, the brain can learn to predict a clock time as well, but it does so by using memory and expectation layered upon the original circadian design. This predictive capacity can reduce the intensity of abrupt awakening if the body begins transitioning toward lighter sleep before the alarm sounds. However, this adjustment depends on regularity. When wake times vary significantly across days, or when sleep is shortened, anticipatory mechanisms may weaken. The internal clock still requires light to stabilize its phase. Conditioning to a specific hour does not eliminate the influence of evening light exposure or seasonal variation. Anthropological comparisons highlight that in societies without fixed alarm schedules, spontaneous waking remains closely aligned with dawn and internal phase. In societies with consistent early start times, Individuals may partially synchronize their circadian rhythm to those times through repeated exposure to morning light and routine. Yet synchronization is not uniform across all chronotypes. Those with later biological tendencies may find complete alignment difficult despite conditioning. The concept of social jet lag illustrates that even with consistent alarms, some individuals experience ongoing discrepancy between internal timing and imposed schedule. The ability to anticipate an alarm also does not change the fundamental structure of sleep cycles. REM and non-REM oscillations continue to unfold in roughly 90-minute patterns. If the alarm interrupts during deep sleep despite anticipation, sleep inertia may still occur. Conditioning can reduce surprise, but it does not fully transform the underlying neurophysiology. From an evolutionary perspective, the capacity to learn regular patterns is adaptive. Early humans would have benefited from anticipating recurring environmental events, such as seasonal changes or predictable group movements. The use of this capacity to anticipate a mechanical alarm reflects flexibility rather than redesign. It illustrates how cultural tools can be integrated into existing neural systems without altering their foundational architecture. The timescale remains critical. Behavioral adaptation can occur within days or weeks. Genetic evolution requires many generations under consistent selective pressure. The widespread use of alarm clocks spans too few generations to have produced significant heritable changes in circadian biology. What we observe instead is the brain's effort to reconcile mechanical time with light-driven rhythms. The question of whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm thus shifts from possibility to alignment. The species can adapt behaviorally to routine signals, but the internal clock remains primarily attuned to dawn. The alarm is accommodated, not anticipated by evolutionary design. Even when behavioral adaptation occurs, it operates within boundaries set by biological structure. The human circadian system can shift gradually in response to consistent schedules, especially when reinforced by morning light exposure. If an individual wakes at the same hour each day and is exposed to bright light soon after rising, the internal clock may advance to align more closely with that routine. This process, known as phase shifting, reflects the plasticity of the circadian pacemaker. However, the shift is incremental. The internal clock does not leap instantly to a new position simply because an alarm demands it. Under natural conditions across roughly 200,000 years of human evolution, phase adjustments occurred gradually in response to seasonal changes in sunrise. Days lengthened or shortened over weeks, and the body recalibrated accordingly. The alarm introduces a different pattern, abrupt imposition of a fixed waking minute that may or may not correspond to internal phase. For some individuals, especially those whose chronotype already trends earlier, repeated early alarms combined with consistent light exposure can bring internal rhythms into closer alignment with schedule. For others, particularly those with later biological tendencies, full alignment may remain incomplete even with regularity. Genetic studies of clock genes reveal persistent variation in circadian preference across populations. This variation suggests that no single wake time optimally fits every individual. In ancestral contexts, such diversity was integrated within group rhythm. In standardized modern contexts, it may be compressed. The internal clock continues to rely primarily on light as its strongest cue. While an alarm can enforce wakefulness at a specific minute, it does not itself reset circadian phase in the same way that light does. If early waking is followed by minimal morning light exposure, for example, during winter months before sunrise, phase adjustment may be limited. The individual may continue to experience a sensation of rising before biological readiness. Over evolutionary time, such persistent early rising in darkness would have been rare outside specific high-latitude settings, and even there seasonal adjustments would have moderated timing. The modern combination of late evening light, fixed early alarms, and limited natural morning light represents a distinct pattern. The body adapts partially through conditioning and gradual phase shifts, yet the underlying architecture remains anchored to environmental light cycles. It is also important to note that adaptation does not necessarily eliminate subjective experience. Individuals may become accustomed to alarm-based waking, yet still feel that spontaneous rising on days without alarms is different, often smoother or less pressured. This observation reflects the coexistence of two timing systems, one internal and light-driven, the other external and mechanical. Behavioral adaptation allows the two to coexist. but it does not erase their distinction. Across thousands of generations shaped by dawn, the internal clock evolved to expect gradual transition supported by environmental cues. Within a few generations, cultural systems have introduced routine, abrupt signals at fixed minutes. The brain can learn these signals, anticipate them, and partially align physiology to them. Yet the evolutionary template remains that of a species whose morning was once defined by the horizon brightening. The question therefore becomes not whether adaptation is possible, but whether the inherited design was ever configured for a daily command that overrides the gradients of light and sleep architecture on which it was originally built. To determine whether waking to an alarm represents a true biological mismatch, it is necessary to define what mismatch means in evolutionary terms. An evolutionary mismatch occurs when traits that once conferred advantage under ancestral conditions become less suited to modern environments. The human circadian system evolved under predictable cycles of light and darkness across approximately 200,000 years. During this vast span, sunrise provided the primary cue for waking, and darkness signaled rest. The nervous system adapted to gradual transitions between these states. When a modern device enforces wakefulness at a fixed minute independent of light or sleep stage, the question is whether this represents a departure significant enough to qualify as mismatch, or whether it is simply a neutral cultural overlay that the body accommodates without meaningful strain. Evidence from sleep science suggests that abrupt awakenings can alter immediate physiological responses compared to spontaneous waking. Heart rate variability, blood pressure trajectories, and the intensity of sleep inertia may differ depending on sleep stage at the moment of awakening. These measurable differences indicate that the body distinguishes between gradient-based transition and sudden stimulation. However, the magnitude and long-term implications of these differences remain subjects of ongoing research. Not every deviation from ancestral pattern constitutes pathology. Human physiology is robust and capable of adaptation. The presence of a measurable difference does not automatically imply dysfunction. To assess mismatch, one must consider frequency, intensity, and cumulative impact. Across most of evolutionary history, abrupt awakening would have occurred in response to unexpected environmental disturbances rather than as a daily routine. The alarm clock transforms what was once an occasional emergency signal into a predictable morning cue. If such repetition engages stress-related pathways more frequently than ancestral patterns did, it may represent a mild mismatch. Yet this assessment must remain cautious. Modern life introduces many variables: diet, physical activity, light exposure that interact with waking patterns. Isolating the alarm itself from these broader factors is complex. Anthropological comparisons offer partial insight. Communities with limited access to electricity and without routine alarm use often wake near sunrise with minimal reliance on mechanical enforcement. Their sleep duration and timing tend to align more closely with environmental light. However, these communities also differ in many other aspects of lifestyle, including exposure to artificial light at night, occupational demands, and social structure. Direct comparison does not yield simple conclusions. Evolutionary reasoning suggests that the human morning was shaped for gradual ascent, not for sharp command. The circadian pacemaker, sleep architecture, and hormonal gradients all point toward tapering transition. The alarm introduces the possibility of routine interruption of this taper. Whether this interruption constitutes significant mismatch depends on context, consistency of sleep schedule, exposure to morning light, alignment with chronotype, and overall sleep duration. In some circumstances, alarm-based waking may be harmonized with biological rhythms through careful management of light and sleep timing. In others, it may create persistent divergence. The concept of mismatch, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single device. It must be evaluated within the broader ecological and behavioral system in which the device operates. The evolutionary template remains one of dawn-based waking across thousands of generations. The alarm is a recent addition layered onto that template. The question is not whether humans can wake to an alarm, but whether the cumulative pattern of alarm-enforced mornings departs meaningfully from the conditions under which the circadian system originally evolved. If the alarm clock represents a potential evolutionary mismatch, the next question is whether the body exhibits signs of strain when this pattern becomes habitual. Strain in biological systems does not always manifest immediately. It may appear subtly through changes in sleep duration, mood regulation, metabolic timing, or cardiovascular patterns. Across approximately 200,000 years of human evolution, waking generally occurred in synchrony with environmental light and internal circadian readiness. The hormonal rise toward morning unfolded gradually. In contrast, alarm-based waking can introduce repeated transitions that do not always align with internal phase, particularly when evening light delays melatonin onset. Over days and weeks, shortened or mistimed sleep can influence broader physiological systems. Research in sleep medicine has linked chronic sleep restriction to changes in glucose regulation, appetite hormones, and inflammatory markers. These associations are not caused solely by alarms, yet alarms often function as the mechanism that truncates sleep in order to meet early schedules. It is important to separate correlation from causation. The alarm clock itself is not a biological toxin. It is a tool that enforces timing. If individuals maintain sufficient sleep duration and align evening light exposure appropriately, alarm-based waking may produce minimal disturbance. However, when late-night activity shortens sleep and early alarms remain fixed, the resulting pattern can generate cumulative sleep debt. Sleep debt, even when mild, can influence cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and metabolic processes. The body's circadian system is designed to coordinate multiple organs around predictable cycles of light and rest. When waking occurs consistently before biological readiness, the coordination among these systems may require ongoing compensation. Studies on shift workers provide insight into more extreme forms of misalignment. Individuals who work night shifts or rotate schedules often experience higher rates of metabolic and cardiovascular disturbances compared to day workers. Alarm-based waking is not equivalent to night shift work, yet both involve divergence between internal circadian phase and imposed schedule. The comparison illustrates that the circadian system is sensitive to timing discrepancies. Over evolutionary time, prolonged misalignment between light exposure and sleep timing would have been uncommon except in extreme latitudes or during rare environmental disruptions. In modern settings, misalignment can become routine. The concept of evolutionary mismatch does not imply inevitable damage. It implies tension between inherited design and new conditions. Whether alarm-based waking constitutes meaningful strain depends on how closely it aligns with the individual's circadian phase and overall sleep need. Some individuals naturally wake early and may require minimal enforcement. Others may rely heavily on alarms to counteract late chronotype or insufficient sleep opportunity. The variability among individuals suggests that alarm clocks interact with biological diversity, rather than imposing identical effects across all users. From an evolutionary perspective, the human morning evolved as a gradient synchronized with dawn. The repeated compression of that gradient into a fixed mechanical minute may introduce subtle pressures when combined with modern light exposure and social expectations. These pressures are not always visible, yet they may accumulate over time. The assessment of mismatch therefore requires careful attention to context. Not only the presence of the alarm, but the broader pattern of sleep timing, light exposure, and alignment with internal rhythm. When considering long-term consequences, it is necessary to move carefully between evidence and assumption. Not every modern divergence from ancestral patterns produces measurable harm. Human physiology is resilient and capable of accommodating many environmental changes. The question is not whether alarm clocks inevitably damage health, but whether their routine use interacts with circadian biology in ways that require ongoing compensation. Across roughly 200,000 years of human existence, waking was embedded in a framework of light-driven synchronization and distributed social rhythms. The introduction of alarm-based waking, especially when combined with late-night light exposure, compresses this framework into a narrower margin between rest and obligation. Research on sleep duration indicates that many adults in industrialized societies obtain fewer hours of sleep than recommended for optimal functioning. Surveys across multiple countries show average sleep times declining relative to earlier historical estimates, though measurement methods vary. Reduced sleep is associated with shifts in metabolic markers, mood stability, and cognitive performance. While these patterns cannot be attributed solely to alarms, the alarm often functions as the mechanism that enforces shortened rest. In addition, the timing of waking relative to circadian phase influences physiological readiness. If an individual consistently wakes during a biological night phase, when melatonin remains elevated and core temperature is low, the body may require greater sympathetic activation to initiate alertness. Over months or years, repeated reliance on abrupt stimulation at misaligned phases could represent a form of low-grade strain. This strain is subtle rather than dramatic. It may appear as chronic morning grogginess, increased reliance on stimulants, or persistent mismatch between sleep need and schedule. The evolutionary perspective does not suggest that humans are incapable of waking to alarms. It suggests that the inherited design was oriented toward gradients rather than commands. The circadian system evolved under skies that brightened gradually, and sleep architecture tapered toward lighter stages near dawn. The modern pattern of late-night illumination followed by fixed early alarms creates conditions that diverge from that template. Whether this divergence produces meaningful long-term effects depends on the degree of alignment between internal clock and external schedule. Individuals who maintain consistent sleep timing, minimize late-night light exposure, and align wake times with chronotype may experience little strain. Those who repeatedly override biological night with early alarms may experience greater tension. From an evolutionary standpoint, mismatch does not require catastrophe. It requires deviation from the conditions under which a system was shaped. The alarm clock represents such a deviation when it replaces dawn as the primary cue for waking. Yet it exists within a broader cultural environment that amplifies or mitigates its impact. The critical question is not whether the device itself is harmful, but whether the pattern of life it supports consistently disregards the light-driven architecture of the circadian system. Over thousands of generations, the human morning was a negotiation between brain chemistry and sunrise. The alarm transforms that negotiation into a directive. Whether that directive can coexist sustainably with inherited biology depends on how carefully modern routines are structured around the ancient rhythms that still govern the body. If the human circadian system evolved to wake with dawn rather than with a mechanical signal, the practical question becomes how modern life might be arranged to reduce tension between these two systems. Industrial schedules, standardized time zones, and global communication networks are unlikely to disappear. The alarm clock will remain a necessary tool for many people, yet the presence of a tool does not determine how it is used. Across approximately 200,000 years of human evolution, waking was supported by gradual light exposure and the tapering of sleep cycles. Modern routines can incorporate elements of that ancestral pattern even within contemporary constraints. One of the most influential variables is light timing. Because the suprachiasmatic nucleus responds strongly to morning light, exposure to bright natural light soon after waking can help advance circadian phase and reinforce alignment with scheduled rising. Opening curtains, stepping outdoors briefly, or positioning oneself near a window can provide signals that the internal clock recognizes. In winter months or regions with limited morning daylight, carefully timed artificial light that mimics morning spectrum may support this alignment. The goal is not to replace natural dawn entirely, but to approximate its cue when schedules require earlier waking. Equally important is the management of evening light. Limiting bright and blue-enriched light in the hours before sleep allows melatonin to rise at an appropriate time, making spontaneous or alarm-based waking more likely to coincide with lighter sleep stages. This adjustment mirrors the ancestral pattern in which darkness deepened gradually after sunset. Consistency of sleep schedule also plays a role. When wake times vary widely between weekdays and weekends, circadian phase can drift, increasing reliance on abrupt alarms to correct misalignment. Maintaining relatively stable bedtimes and wake times supports the brain's predictive mechanisms, sometimes allowing awakening to occur naturally near the set time. Such practices do not eliminate the alarm but reduce the gap between internal readiness and external demand. From an evolutionary perspective, these adjustments represent attempts to restore elements of the light-driven template within a technologically mediated environment. They acknowledge that the circadian system remains fundamentally attuned to gradients of light and hormone rather than to numbers on a dial. Over thousands of generations, human mornings unfolded with incremental change, temperature rising, sky brightening, neural activity increasing. While modern obligations may necessitate fixed schedules, integrating gradual sensory cues into the transition from sleep can soften the shift. Some individuals use alarms with gentler sound profiles or increasing volume to approximate a gradient rather than a shock. Others rely on light-based alarms that simulate sunrise. These tools attempt to align mechanical timing with biological expectation. The broader lesson is not that alarm clocks must be abandoned, but that their impact depends on context. The species that evolved under open skies still carries within it the architecture shaped by dawn. Modern routines can either disregard that architecture or work alongside it. The closer waking aligns with internal circadian phase and natural light cues, the less abrupt the transition may feel. In this way, contemporary life can acknowledge its technological reality while remaining attentive to the evolutionary foundations of the human morning. Beyond light management and schedule consistency, the quality of the transition itself can influence how the body interprets morning. Over approximately 200,000 years of human evolution, waking unfolded within an ecological and social buffer. Individuals did not typically move from deep sleep directly into complex cognitive tasks within seconds. There was often a short interval of low-demand activity stretching, tending embers, quiet conversation, observation of surroundings. This interval allowed cardiovascular, hormonal, and neural systems to complete their ascent into full alertness. Modern routines frequently compress this interval. The alarm sounds, and within minutes individuals may be navigating traffic, checking digital communication, or making decisions requiring executive function. Restoring even a brief transitional buffer can approximate aspects of the ancestral gradient. Allowing a few minutes of calm wakefulness before engaging with intense stimuli provides time for cortical regions to synchronize more fully. This does not require abandoning modern obligations. It requires acknowledging the staged nature of neural reactivation. Breathing patterns also shift during the transition from sleep to wakefulness. Deep, steady breathing supports parasympathetic balance, whereas rapid movement immediately after abrupt awakening may amplify sympathetic activation. Simple practices such as sitting upright briefly, allowing vision to adjust gradually to light, and avoiding immediate exposure to high-intensity digital stimuli can reduce the perception of shock associated with alarms. These adjustments echo the layered reactivation described earlier in the context of sleep architecture. Over evolutionary time, the environment provided gradients automatically. In modern contexts, individuals can recreate elements of those gradients intentionally. Social structure also influences the morning experience. In ancestral groups, distributed waking created overlap between sleepers and early risers. Quiet human presence accompanied the transition. In many contemporary households, synchronized schedules reduce this overlap, yet small adjustments such as shared calm routines or exposure to natural light together can restore some social buffering. The alarm need not represent an isolated rupture if it is integrated into a wider pattern that respects circadian timing. From a biological perspective, the aim is not to eliminate sympathetic activation entirely. The body requires mobilization to begin the day. The aim is to align that mobilization with internal readiness rather than to provoke it prematurely. Studies on gradual light-based alarms indicate that simulated dawn can reduce subjective sleep inertia compared to sudden acoustic alarms, particularly when light exposure begins before the set wake time. These findings suggest that aligning mechanical cues with the internal clock sensitivity to light can soften the transition. While not a perfect substitute for natural sunrise, such approaches recognize the evolutionary orientation of the circadian system. The broader implication is that modern life need not be positioned in opposition to biological design. Across thousands of generations, the human morning was shaped by slow change and environmental signals. By consciously incorporating light timing, consistent schedules, and brief transitional buffers, contemporary routines can approximate that template within existing constraints. The alarm clock remains a tool, but its impact is mediated by the context in which it operates. The species that once woke with the horizon brightening still carries the neural and hormonal architecture of that experience. Modern mornings can either disregard or respect that inheritance. When we step back from physiology and history, the question returns to a quieter place. For approximately 200,000 years, human beings woke because the world around them changed. Light entered the sky, air warmed, sound gathered slowly, hormones shifted before thought began, sleep cycles thinned toward awareness. Morning was not an order, it was an emergence. The alarm clock represents a different logic. It does not wait for gradients. It declares a boundary. It speaks at a fixed minute regardless of season, latitude, or internal phase. The body can respond to that declaration. It can adapt behaviorally, anticipate routine, and compensate through sympathetic activation. Yet the architecture within the brain, the circadian pacemaker, the oscillation of sleep stages, the hormonal ascent toward dawn, remains rooted in a much older conversation with the rising sun. The contrast is not dramatic, it is structural. One system evolved slowly across thousands of generations under predictable celestial cycles. The other appeared within a few centuries to meet the demands of industrial and post-industrial coordination. The human organism now lives at the intersection of these two timelines. This does not require rejection of modern schedules. It requires awareness of scale. The internal clock still responds most powerfully to light, not to numbers. The nervous system still differentiates between gradual transition and abrupt stimulation. When alarm-based waking aligns closely with circadian phase supported by appropriate evening darkness and morning light, the difference between natural and mechanical cues may narrow. When it diverges, when nights are extended by artificial illumination, and mornings imposed in darkness, the gap widens. Across evolutionary history, mornings were staggered within groups, distributed across individuals with varied chronotypes. Modern life often compresses this diversity into synchronized minutes. Whether this compression constitutes significant strain depends on how rigidly it overrides biological signals. The evidence suggests that humans were not specifically designed for daily abrupt acoustic awakening. They were designed for light-driven ascent, yet they possess flexibility that allows adaptation to many modern conditions. The deeper insight may not be about prohibition, but about alignment. A species shaped by dawn carries within it expectations written in genes and neural circuits. When modern tools are used with awareness of those expectations, when light is respected, sleep is protected, and transitions are softened, the tension between evolution and schedule can be reduced. The alarm clock does not redefine what humans are. It reveals the difference between inherited rhythm and constructed time. As night falls and the body prepares once more for rest, the internal clock continues its ancient cycle, anticipating the next morning's light whether or not a device will interrupt it. The earth will turn as it always has. The question that remains is not simply whether humans were meant to wake to an alarm clock, but how closely their modern mornings can still echo the slow brightening that shaped them in the beginning.